a flat stretch of land in eastern Poland. Fields that seem ordinary at first glance. Low sky, quiet wind moving through open space. There are no large stone walls here today. No vast industrial complex rising from the ground. And yet, this place played a role far larger than its size suggests. This was Trawniki, not built first as an extermination camp, not known for massive barracks like Auschwitz, but something different, something structural. In 1941 and 1942, as the Nazi regime moved from persecution to systematic mass murder in occupied Poland, Trawniki became a training ground, a place where auxiliary guards were prepared, organized, and assigned. Men who would later serve at extermination camps such as Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec passed through here. Trawniki was not always the final destination for victims. It was the place that prepared the machinery. In this documentary, we will examine the complete history of Trawniki, its origins as a labor camp, its transformation into an SS training center, its role in Operation Reinhard, the structure of its administration, and its connection to the wider system of extermination in occupied Poland. And before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to In&Out Nazi Germany, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every story, every memory, and every place matters. And together we keep history alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, Segment 1. Geographic setting and the landscape of Eastern Poland. Trawniki is located in Eastern Poland, southeast of Lublin, in a region defined less by dramatic terrain than by open fields, low agricultural horizons, scattered villages, and railway lines that connect rural settlements to larger administrative centers. And it is precisely this ordinary geography that shaped its historical significance, because unlike camps constructed in remote mountain areas or heavily industrialized urban zones, Trawniki existed within a flat and accessible landscape that allowed for transportation, expansion, and integration into broader occupation policy. And before the war, it functioned as a modest settlement with agricultural surroundings, positioned near rail infrastructure that would later prove essential to its transformation under German occupation. And when Nazi Germany invaded Poland in September 1939 and incorporated the region into the general government, the area around Lublin became a focal point for administrative experimentation, forced labor, policy, and eventually extermination planning, embedding Trawniki within a wider territorial strategy rather than isolating it as a singular installation, and the physical terrain itself offered practical advantages for the occupying authorities, as its level ground facilitated construction of barracks, guard facilities, and training areas without the need for extensive engineering modification, and its railway access enabled the movement of prisoners, supplies, and personnel with relative efficiency, linking the site directly to Lublin and, by extension, to other camps and administrative centers in occupied Poland, and the surrounding rural environment provided both visibility and concealment, because while the camp structures were not hidden in mountainous terrain, the open fields and modest local population reduced external interference, reinforcing a controlled perimeter within a familiar agricultural setting. And as the occupation regime consolidated power in 1940 and 1941, sites like Trawniki were selected not for their dramatic remoteness but for their logistical suitability within the general government, illustrating how geography shaped the expansion of the SS infrastructure across eastern Poland and the region's integration into the rail network that connected Lublin to Chelm, Zamość, and other towns. Positioned Trawniki strategically within a corridor that would later intersect with Operation Reinhard, embedding the camp within the spatial architecture of genocide that emerged in 1942, and understanding this geographic context is essential, because Trawniki did not emerge spontaneously as a training camp, but evolved within a landscape already restructured by occupation policy, forced labor demands, and demographic engineering, and the quiet fields surrounding the settlement masked the administrative intensity that would define its role, as the ordinary agricultural rhythm of eastern Poland was gradually overlaid by SS authority, guard barracks, and prisoner compounds, transforming familiar land into a site of institutional function. And even today, when visitors approach the location, the calm rural environment stands in contrast to the historical weight embedded there, reinforcing the central theme that many pivotal sites of the Holocaust were not geographically extraordinary but structurally significant. And as we begin the full history of Trawniki, we start with this landscape because the flat ground, the rail lines, and the proximity to Lublin shaped every subsequent development, anchoring the camp within the broader geography of occupation and laying the physical foundation for its transformation into one of the key training centers behind the death camps of Operation Reinhard. Chapter 1, Segment 2. Pre-war Trawniki and the Transformation under Occupation. Before the arrival of German occupation authorities and the reconfiguration of the region under Nazi rule, Trawniki was a small settlement within eastern Poland whose identity was shaped primarily by agriculture, local trade, and its modest connection to nearby towns through railway lines. And like many villages in the Lublin district, it reflected the multi-ethnic character of pre-war Poland, with Polish and Jewish residents living within a shared but socially distinct community structure, embedded within the rhythms of rural life that defined the region during the interwar period. And the built environment consisted of simple homes, small workshops, and infrastructure oriented toward farming and local commerce rather than large-scale industry, meaning that nothing in its pre-war appearance suggested the role it would later assume within the machinery of occupation and genocide. Yet when Germany invaded Poland in September 1939 and established the general government, Eastern districts such as Lublin became laboratories for administrative experimentation, demographic engineering, and forced labor policy. And it was within this broader restructuring that Trawniki began to shift from a civilian settlement into a site of SS interest, because the occupation authorities sought locations suitable for labor camps and auxiliary training facilities. And the combination of open land, existing rail access, and relative distance from major urban centers made Trawniki strategically practical, and by 1940 the Germans had begun establishing forced labor camps in various parts of the Lublin district, embedding detention facilities within rural landscapes that could be supervised with limited resistance, and the transformation of Trawniki was gradual rather than immediate, as administrative directives redefined the space step by step, first incorporating it into occupation logistics and later expanding its function to include the housing of prisoners and the training of auxiliary personnel, illustrating how the shift from ordinary village to SS installation occurred through bureaucratic planning rather than sudden dramatic construction. And this process reflects a broader pattern in the Holocaust, where everyday spaces were systematically converted into instruments of control through administrative decree, and the presence of the railway line became increasingly central to this transformation, as it allowed the transport of detainees and materials, linking Trawniki to Lublin, where SS leadership under figures such as Odilo Globoknik coordinated policies that would culminate in Operation Reinhard. And by the time the site was formally integrated into SS infrastructure, the civilian landscape had been reshaped into a controlled compound with barracks, fencing, and guard oversight, replacing the agricultural focus of the pre-war settlement with institutional order. And examining this transition clarifies that Trawniki's significance cannot be separated from the occupation policies that preceded its role as a training camp, because its emergence was rooted in the systematic reorganization of territory and population that defined German rule in eastern Poland, and the quiet fields that once supported farming gradually became enclosed within a perimeter of authority, embedding within the rural environment a structure that would later supply trained guards to extermination centers across the region. And as Chapter 1 continues, this pre-war and early occupation history establishes the foundation for understanding how Trawniki evolved from an ordinary settlement into a central node within the administrative architecture of genocide, shaped by geography, rail access, and deliberate policy rather than by isolation or accident. Chapter 1, Segment 3. Early camp establishment and the arrival of prisoners. By late 1940 and into 1941, the transformation of Trawniki from a modest rural settlement into a site of confinement became more clearly defined, as German occupation authorities formalized its use as a forced labor camp within the Lublin district, embedding it within the expanding SS infrastructure that was taking shape across the general government. And the early establishment phase was characterized not by monumental construction but by incremental adaptation, as existing buildings were repurposed, wooden barracks were erected, and fencing delineated a controlled perimeter within the previously open landscape, creating a compound that reflected administrative intent rather than architectural grandeur. And the first prisoners brought to Trawniki were primarily Jews from nearby towns and ghettos, compelled into forced labor under SS supervision as part of broader occupation policy that sought to exploit Jewish labor while isolating communities through ghettoization and camp confinement, and the camp's proximity to Lublin allowed it to operate under the authority of SS and police leader WWII, whose office coordinated numerous labor and detention sites throughout the district, reinforcing that Trawnike's development was integrated into a centralized administrative network, and the early labor assignments at the camp included tasks such as construction, agricultural work, and maintenance, embedding the prisoners within the practical needs of the occupation regime. And the layout of the camp during this period consisted of separate zones for prisoner housing and guard facilities, illustrating the spatial hierarchy that defined SS installations across occupied Poland. And the railway connection once again proved central, as it facilitated the arrival of detainees and the shipment of goods, linking Trawniki to other forced labor camps and ghettos within the region. And this phase of development preceded the formal implementation of Operation Reinhard, yet it laid essential groundwork, because the infrastructure established for labor and detention would later support the site's transformation into a training center for auxiliary guards. And examining the early camp establishment reveals how the administrative logic of confinement preceded extermination policy, embedding control structures within the rural environment before the machinery of mass murder was fully operational. And the arrival of prisoners during this period marked the beginning of Trawnike's function as a site of coercion and surveillance, even if its later notoriety as a training camp had not yet emerged. And the daily routine in these early months mirrored other labor camps in the district, with roll calls, guard patrols, and ration distribution shaping the rhythm of existence within the fenced compound, reinforcing how Trawniki initially fit within a broader category of forced labor installations rather than standing apart. And yet the strategic location and expanding administrative authority surrounding Lublin ensured that its role would soon evolve beyond labor. As the occupation regime shifted from exploitation to systematic extermination, and as Chapter 1 progresses, this early establishment phase clarifies that Trawnike's later function as a training center was built upon a foundation already structured for control, illustrating how geography, occupation policy, and incremental institutional development converged in the fields of Eastern Poland to create a site that would soon play a critical role behind the death camps of Operation Reinhard. Chapter 1, Segment 4. Integration into the Lublin District SS structure. As the camp at Trawniki developed during 1941, its administrative identity became increasingly defined by its integration into the SS and police structure centered in Lublin, embedding it within a regional framework that would soon serve as the operational core of Operation Reinhard. And this integration marked a decisive shift from a localized forced labor site into a component of a broader institutional system directed by SS and police leader WWII, whose authority extended over camps, ghettos, and security operations throughout the district, reinforcing that Trawnike's growth was not accidental but aligned with centralized planning. And the Lublin district itself occupied a unique position within the general government, functioning as both an administrative center and a testing ground for policies aimed at restructuring demographic and territorial order under Nazi rule. And within this environment, camps such as Trawniki were assigned functions that evolved alongside shifting policy priorities, illustrating the flexibility of the SS apparatus in adapting infrastructure to new objectives. And administrative records from the period indicate that personnel assignments, guard oversight, and prisoner transfers were coordinated through Lublin offices, embedding Trawniki within a chain of command that linked it directly to decision-making authorities responsible for labor deployment and later extermination logistics. And the railway connection between Trawniki and Lublin further reinforced this administrative integration, allowing rapid communication and movement of materials and personnel, and the physical layout of the camp reflected its growing importance, with additional barracks constructed and security measures reinforced to accommodate expanding functions, illustrating how incremental spatial changes paralleled administrative elevation, and by late 1941, the region was undergoing intensified transformation as preparations for Operation Reinhard advanced, and although the extermination centers at Belzec, Sobibór, and Treblinka would be established separately, the Lublin district infrastructure, including Trawniki, formed part of the supporting network that enabled these operations, underscoring that genocide relied not only on killing sites but also on training, administration, and logistical coordination, and examining Trawnike's integration into this SS structure reveals how seemingly modest installations could become central nodes within a larger system, demonstrating that the Holocaust's implementation depended on layered institutional relationships rather than isolated camps acting independently, and the rural landscape surrounding Trawniki continued to appear unchanged to casual observers. Yet within its fenced perimeter, administrative routines intensified, guard training expanded, and bureaucratic oversight tightened, embedding the camp more firmly within the organizational architecture that defined the Lublin district in 1942, and as Chapter 1 continues, this integration into regional SS authority clarifies how Trawnike's geographic and administrative positioning prepared it for its subsequent transformation into a training center whose influence would extend far beyond its immediate location, shaping the personnel who staffed the death camps of Operation Reinhard and reinforcing the systemic continuity that connected eastern Poland's rural fields to the machinery of extermination. Chapter 1, Segment 5. From Labor Camp to Institutional Pivot Point. By the end of 1941, Trawniki had moved beyond its initial function as a forced labor site and stood at the threshold of a more consequential transformation, positioned within the administrative orbit of Lublin at a moment when Nazi policy in occupied Poland was shifting from exploitation and segregation towards systematic extermination. And this transition did not occur abruptly but unfolded through layered adjustments in purpose, personnel, and infrastructure, illustrating how institutional evolution often precedes visible change, and the camp's earlier development as a controlled labor compound provided the physical framework necessary for expansion, including fenced perimeters, barracks, guard facilities, and rail access, embedding within the rural landscape a structure that could be repurposed without dramatic reconstruction. And as Operation Reinhard planning intensified in late 1941 and early 1942 under the authority of Odilo Globoknik, the need for trained auxiliary personnel capable of staffing new extermination centers became increasingly urgent, creating demand for a centralized training facility where non-German recruits could be organized, instructed, and assigned, and Trawnike's geographic and administrative integration made it suitable for this role, because it was already embedded within SS command channels and positioned near Lublin, the operational hub of Reinhard activities, and thus the camp began to shift from a peripheral labor installation to what would become an institutional pivot point within the larger genocidal system, reinforcing that the Holocaust depended not only on death camps themselves but on the preparation and coordination of personnel behind them, and this shift also reflects the broader dynamic of Nazi occupation policy, where spaces were continually reassigned according to strategic priorities, demonstrating the flexibility and bureaucratic continuity of the SS apparatus, and the physical environment of Trawniki, with its open fields and accessible rail line, facilitated this transformation, allowing for the arrival of new recruits and the redistribution of trained guards to sites such as Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, embedding the camp within the logistical chain that supported mass murder. And understanding this transitional phase clarifies that Trawnike's historical significance lies not only in what occurred within its perimeter but in what radiated outward from it, as personnel trained there carried institutional methods and disciplinary structures into the extermination centers, reinforcing the systemic character of Operation Reinhard, and the quiet agricultural landscape that once defined the settlement now contained within it an emerging training compound whose influence would extend far beyond eastern Poland, illustrating how ordinary geography can become a foundational element in extraordinary crimes when integrated into organized administrative frameworks. And as Chapter 1 concludes, Trawniki stands fully contextualized. A rural site transformed step by step through occupation policy, labor exploitation, and regional SS integration into a preparatory ground that would soon operate behind the death camps, shaping the human infrastructure that enabled one of the most lethal phases of the Holocaust. Chapter 2, Segment 1. The arrival of Soviet prisoners of war and the formation of the Auxiliary Guard Unit. In late 1941 and early 1942, as the German invasion of the Soviet Union reshaped the Eastern Front and brought millions of Soviet prisoners of war into German custody, the SS leadership within the Lublin district began drawing from this captive population to form auxiliary guard units that would serve in occupied Poland, and it was within this context that Trawniki assumed a new and decisive role, because the camp was selected as a centralized training and deployment site for these non-German auxiliaries, embedding it directly into the evolving structure of Operation Reinhard, and the recruits who arrived at Trawniki were primarily Soviet POWs, many of whom had been captured during the initial phases of Operation Barbarossa and subsequently separated from main camps under conditions of severe deprivation, and SS authorities identified among them individuals considered suitable for recruitment into guard service, often selecting men from regions such as Ukraine and other Soviet territories, reinforcing the broader strategy of utilizing non-German personnel to supplement SS manpower. And upon arrival at Trawniki, these recruits were organized into a structured training program that combined military-style discipline with ideological indoctrination, reflecting the administrative precision characteristic of SS institutions, and the camp's physical layout was adapted to accommodate this new function, with separate barracks designated for trainees, drill areas established within the compound, and command oversight structured through appointed SS officers responsible for instruction and evaluation, illustrating how the site's earlier labor infrastructure facilitated rapid transformation into a training facility, and the formation of what became known as the Trawniki men marked a significant development in the implementation of Operation Reinhard, because these auxiliaries would be assigned to extermination camps including Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, as well as to guard duties in ghettos and labor camps, embedding the influence of Trawniki far beyond its geographic boundaries. And examining this early stage of recruitment reveals how the SS combined pragmatic manpower needs with administrative control, creating a semi-military unit under German supervision that could operate within the genocidal system while remaining distinct from regular Waffen-SS formations. And the process of selection, training, and deployment was coordinated through Lublin, reinforcing Trawnike's integration within the regional command network led by Odilo Globoknik. And this transformation from labor camp to guard training center underscores the structural logic of the Holocaust, where preparation, coordination, and personnel management were as essential as the physical sites of killing, and the rural fields surrounding Trawniki once again provided a quiet backdrop to institutional development, masking the fact that within the fenced compound a new cadre of auxiliary guards was being prepared for roles that would become central to the execution of Operation Reinhard. And as Chapter 2 begins, the arrival of Soviet POW recruits and the formation of the Trawniki Guard Unit mark the moment when the camp's purpose expanded decisively, embedding it at the operational heart of the machinery behind the death camps. Chapter 2, Segment 2. Training Structure, Discipline, and Ideological Conditioning. Once the first groups of Soviet prisoners of war selected for auxiliary service arrived at Trawniki, the camp's internal organization was reshaped to accommodate a structured training regime designed to transform captives into disciplined guards under SS supervision. And this process reflected both practical and ideological objectives, because the SS required personnel capable of maintaining order, enforcing confinement, and participating in deportation operations, while also ensuring loyalty to German command, And the training program implemented at Trawniki combined elements of military drill, guard instruction, and political orientation, embedding recruits within a hierarchical framework that mirrored SS command culture, and daily routines included physical exercises, weapons handling, formation drills, and instruction on camp security procedures, illustrating how the site's open grounds were utilized as practical training spaces within the fenced compound, and German SS officers assigned to Trawniki oversaw these activities directly, establishing clear chains of authority and reinforcing discipline through structured routines, and the recruits were organized into units with designated leaders, creating a layered command structure that facilitated deployment to external camps once training was completed, and alongside practical instruction, ideological conditioning played a significant role, as recruits were exposed to narratives portraying Jews and other targeted groups as enemies of the German Reich, reinforcing dehumanizing frameworks that underpinned Operation Reinhard, and this combination of drill and indoctrination aimed to standardize behavior, ensuring that the auxiliary guards could function cohesively within extermination and ghetto environments despite their diverse origins. And the presence of these training activities transformed Trawniki into more than a detention site. It became a preparatory institution that supplied personnel across occupied Poland, embedding the camp's influence within the operational fabric of Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and numerous labor camps, and the structured nature of the program illustrates the bureaucratic precision of the SS system, where recruitment, evaluation, and assignment were documented and coordinated through regional command channels in Lublin, reinforcing administrative continuity between Trawniki and the broader Reinhard apparatus. And the rural setting once again contrasts with the intensity of activity within the compound, as the quiet fields concealed a disciplined regimen shaping men who would soon stand at the gates and perimeters of extermination centers. And examining this training structure clarifies that the Holocaust relied not only on centralized decision-making but on the systematic preparation of personnel capable of carrying out orders, embedding Trawniki at a foundational level of the genocidal process. And as Chapter 2 continues, the focus on discipline and ideological conditioning underscores how the transformation of Soviet POWs into auxiliary guards was neither spontaneous nor chaotic, but organized through deliberate planning, hierarchical control, and routine repetition within the controlled environment of the Trawniki camp. Chapter 2, Segment 3: Command Personnel and the Administrative Chain of Authority. As the training program at Trawniki expanded in 1942 and increasing numbers of auxiliary guards were processed through the camp, the importance of clear command structures and administrative oversight became central to its function, embedding the site firmly within the SS hierarchy operating in the Lublin district, and the camp was placed under the authority of German SS officers who were responsible not only for supervising training but also for maintaining discipline, managing deployment schedules, and reporting directly to higher offices connected to Operation Reinhard, illustrating that Trawniki was never an isolated training ground, but a coordinated component of a regional system directed by SS and police leader Odilo Globoknik, and the command personnel assigned to Trawniki were experienced members of the SS who carried institutional knowledge from other camps and police units, reinforcing continuity between earlier concentration camp practices and the new role of auxiliary training. And these officers structured the camp's daily operations through written directives, inspections, and documentation, ensuring that each recruit's progress was monitored and that unit organization remained consistent with operational requirements at extermination sites, and the chain of authority extended upward through Lublin offices to central SS leadership within the general government, embedding Trawniki within a bureaucratic framework that linked local instruction to regional planning, and this administrative integration ensured that when guards were dispatched to Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, or other locations, their assignments were coordinated within a larger deployment strategy aligned with deportation schedules and extermination capacity, underscoring how personnel management was synchronized with broader genocidal logistics, and the command culture within Trawniki reflected SS institutional norms, emphasizing obedience, hierarchy, and accountability, and this culture was reinforced through inspections, evaluations, and structured communication channels, illustrating the administrative rigor that characterized the camp's operation, and examining the leadership structure reveals that Trawnike's effectiveness as a training center depended on disciplined coordination between German officers and the auxiliary recruits under their supervision, embedding the camp's internal order within the broader SS network that sustained Operation Reinhard. And the rural landscape outside the compound remained unchanged. Yet within its perimeter a tightly organized administrative system functioned daily, shaping personnel who would soon operate in extermination centers across occupied Poland. And as Chapter 2 progresses, the focus on command and hierarchy clarifies that Trawnike's role in the Holocaust was not merely a byproduct of circumstance but the result of deliberate administrative planning, where authority flowed through defined channels and training was aligned with operational objectives, reinforcing the systemic character of the machinery behind the death camps. Chapter 2, Segment 4. Deployment to Operation Reinhard camps and ghetto actions. As the training cycles at Trawniki intensified throughout 1942, the purpose of the Auxiliary Guard program became increasingly visible through the pattern of deployment assignments issued from the camp, embedding its graduates directly into the operational structure of Operation Reinhard. And once recruits had completed drill instruction, weapons familiarization, and ideological orientation under SS supervision, they were organized into transport groups and dispatched by rail to extermination. Centers such as Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, as well as to labor camps and urban ghettos undergoing liquidation, illustrating how Trawniki functioned as a personnel reservoir feeding multiple sites across occupied Poland. And this system of deployment was coordinated through Lublin under the authority of Odilo Globoknik's staff, ensuring that manpower needs at individual camps were matched with trained auxiliaries available at Trawniki, and the railway infrastructure once again proved central, allowing efficient transfer of guards from the rural training compound to locations where deportation transports were arriving daily, reinforcing the logistical continuity between preparation and execution phases of the genocidal process. And the Trawniki men, as they came to be known, were typically assigned to perimeter guard duty, escort responsibilities, and supervision roles during deportations and camp operations, acting under the direct authority of German SS officers while providing essential manpower that enabled extermination centers to function with limited German personnel. And examining this deployment pattern reveals how the Holocaust relied not solely on German SS cadres, but on a broader network of auxiliaries trained and organized through institutional sites like Trawniki, embedding the camp within the structural backbone of Operation Reinhard rather than situating it at the periphery. And the integration of these guards into ghetto liquidations further demonstrates the reach of the training program, as units were dispatched to assist in the clearing of Jewish populations from towns and cities throughout the Lublin district and beyond, reinforcing the systemic link between Trawniki and the destruction of Jewish communities across eastern Poland. And the administrative documentation of assignments, though fragmented in surviving records, indicates regular reporting channels that tracked guard movements and confirmed receipt of personnel at destination camps, illustrating the bureaucratic precision underlying what might otherwise appear as chaotic expansion. And the rural quiet of Trawniki belied the extent of its outward influence, as each departing train carrying newly trained auxiliaries represented an extension of the camp's function into the extermination landscape. And by analyzing the deployment structure, we see clearly that Trawniki operated not as an isolated camp, but as a dynamic node within a coordinated genocidal network where training, assignment, and operational integration were synchronized to sustain the tempo of Operation Reinhard throughout 1942 and into 1943, reinforcing that the machinery behind the death camps depended on preparation sites like Trawniki just as much as on the killing centers themselves. Chapter 2, Segment 5. The identity of the Trawniki men and their structural rolled-up by late 1942. The auxiliary guards trained at Trawniki had become a distinct and recognizable component within the broader SS system in occupied Poland, and although they were not members of the German SS in the formal sense, their integration into extermination and camp operations gave rise to a functional identity that historians now refer to as the Trawniki men. embedding the camp's name directly into the historical vocabulary of Operation Reinhard, and this designation reflects both their origin at the training facility and their structural role within the machinery of deportation, ghetto liquidation, and extermination camp administration. And the formation of this auxiliary corps addressed a practical challenge faced by SS leadership, because the rapid expansion of killing operations required personnel beyond the capacity of German units alone, and by recruiting and training Soviet prisoners of war and other non-German volunteers or conscripts under controlled conditions at Trawniki, the SS effectively created a semi-military auxiliary force that could be deployed flexibly across multiple sites, reinforcing the adaptability of the genocidal system. And the Trawniki men operated under German command but were essential in maintaining perimeter security, escorting deportees, supervising forced labor details, and reinforcing the guard presence at camps such as Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, illustrating how their role extended beyond symbolic participation to daily operational involvement, and their existence demonstrates the layered structure of authority within the Holocaust, where German SS officers directed policy and overall command while auxiliaries provided manpower that enabled sustained implementation, embedding Trawniki at a foundational level within the structure behind the death camps. And the identity of these men was shaped not only by training but by documentation, as administrative records listed assignments, transfers, and disciplinary measures, reinforcing that their status was formally recognized within the SS apparatus. And examining this structural role clarifies that Trawniki functioned as more than a logistical staging ground. It became a generator of personnel whose presence multiplied the operational capacity of extermination centers during the height of Operation Reinhard in 1942 and 1943, and the rural landscape that once defined the settlement now carried an institutional imprint extending far beyond its boundaries, because every auxiliary dispatched from Trawniki represented a direct link between the training compound and the sites of mass murder to which he was assigned, and understanding the formation and deployment of the Trawniki men underscores the systemic character of the Holocaust, revealing how preparation, manpower allocation, and hierarchical supervision converged within a single camp to sustain the machinery of destruction. And as Chapter 2 concludes, the emergence of this auxiliary identity marks the full transformation of Trawniki into a central training hub behind the death camps, embedding its role permanently within the operational history of Operation Reinhard and reinforcing that genocide depended not only on centralized orders but on structured human networks prepared in places like this quiet clearing in eastern Poland. Chapter 3, Segment 1. Physical layout and the spatial division of the camp. As Trawniki expanded into its role as both a labor site and a training center for auxiliary guards, its physical layout evolved into a carefully organized compound reflecting the dual functions embedded within its perimeter, and understanding this spatial arrangement is essential to grasping how the camp operated on a daily basis, because geography inside the fence mirrored hierarchy, authority, and purpose, and the camp was divided into clearly separated zones that distinguished between the areas designated for Jewish prisoners and those reserved for the training and housing of auxiliary recruits under SS supervision, reinforcing the layered structure that defined its institutional character. And wooden barracks formed the core of both sections, arranged in rows that facilitated surveillance and movement control, while administrative offices and guard quarters were positioned to allow oversight across the compound, embedding supervision directly into spatial design. And the perimeter fencing enclosed the camp in a rectangular formation aligned with the surrounding rural landscape. Yet inside this enclosure, the ordinary agricultural terrain was transformed into a controlled environment structured by routine and command, and drill grounds for auxiliary training were established within open sections of the compound, allowing for weapons instruction, formation exercises, and disciplinary inspections, illustrating how physical space was adapted to accommodate the evolving role of the site. And separate storage buildings and supply depots supported the logistical needs of both prisoners and trainees, reinforcing the camp's function as a self-contained administrative unit linked to Lublin through rail transport and reporting channels, and the railway line itself ran close enough to facilitate the arrival and departure of personnel, embedding the camp within a transportation network that connected it to extermination centers and ghettos throughout occupied Poland. And within the prisoner section, barracks were often overcrowded, reflecting the broader pattern of forced labor camps in the region, while the auxiliary section emphasized order and regimentation, underscoring the contrast between those confined under coercion and those being prepared to enforce it elsewhere, and guard towers and patrol paths traced the boundary, reinforcing the visibility of authority even within a relatively flat and open landscape. And examining this spatial division clarifies that Trawnike's design was not incidental but structured to serve its dual purposes efficiently, embedding within its layout the administrative logic that linked training, confinement, and deployment into a cohesive system, and the quiet fields surrounding the camp masked this carefully organized interior, where each barrack, fence line, and drill area contributed to the operational continuity that sustained Operation Reinhard. And as Chapter 3 begins, the focus on physical layout reveals how architecture and geography combined to create a space where preparation and persecution coexisted within clearly defined zones, reinforcing the systemic nature of the machinery behind the death camps. Chapter 3, Segment 2. Daily routine within the training compound. Within the structured perimeter of Trawniki, daily life unfolded according to regimented schedules that reflected the camp's dual identity as both a labor installation and a training center for auxiliary guards. And the rhythm of each day was shaped by routine, supervision, and repetition, embedding discipline into the physical space described in the previous segment. And for the auxiliary recruits housed in designated barracks under SS oversight, mornings typically began with assembly and roll call, where attendance was verified and instructions issued for the day's training cycle, reinforcing the hierarchical relationship between German officers and the men under instruction. And following roll call, drill exercises occupied a central role, with formation marching, weapons handling, and guard procedure rehearsals conducted in open areas within the compound, illustrating how the camp's layout supported regimented movement and standardized instruction. And these exercises were not improvised but structured according to clear guidelines, ensuring that each recruit learned patrol protocols, perimeter supervision techniques, and escort procedures that would later be applied at extermination camps and ghettos, embedding operational continuity between preparation and deployment. And midday periods included additional instruction sessions, sometimes focused on security measures, identification of prisoners, or reinforcement of ideological narratives that framed their future. Assignments within the broader objectives of the German occupation, illustrating how practical training was interwoven with political messaging designed to normalize their roles within the system. And the presence of SS officers during these sessions underscored the camp's administrative oversight as evaluations were conducted and performance assessed, reinforcing accountability within the chain of command. And while auxiliary recruits followed a structured military-style routine, Jewish prisoners confined within the labor section of the camp experienced a different daily rhythm defined by forced labor assignments, ration distribution, and strict surveillance, illustrating the layered coexistence of preparation and coercion within the same compound. And the contrast between these routines highlights the structural hierarchy embedded in Trawnike's design, where one group was trained to enforce while another was compelled to endure, and the railway line near the camp occasionally signaled departures and arrivals that interrupted routine, as groups of trained auxiliaries were transported outward and new recruits or prisoners arrived, embedding movement into the camp's daily cycle. And examining the routine of Trawniki clarifies that the camp's function depended on predictability and order, where repetition created efficiency and discipline sustained institutional continuity, reinforcing that genocide relied not only on ideological intent but on the standardized daily operations of places like this. And as Chapter 3 continues, this focus on routine demonstrates how the quiet rural setting concealed a highly organized schedule that prepared personnel for deployment into the death camps of Operation Reinhard, while maintaining the internal structure necessary for sustained control within its own perimeter. Chapter 3, Segment 3. The Prisoner Section and the Coexistence of Labor and Training. While Trawniki became widely known for its role in training auxiliary guards, its identity as a site of Jewish forced labor remained central to its daily operation, and the coexistence of these two functions within a single fenced compound reveals the layered structure that defined the camp, because alongside the barracks and drill grounds designated for recruits stood separate sections housing Jewish prisoners compelled into labor under SS authority, embedding preparation for extermination. Alongside the exploitation and confinement of those already targeted by occupation policy, and the prisoner section was organized into rows of wooden barracks that were often overcrowded, reflecting the broader conditions characteristic of forced labor camps throughout the Lublin district, and daily life for prisoners was shaped by roll calls, work assignments, ration distribution, and constant supervision, illustrating the systematic control embedded within even smaller satellite camps. And labor tasks assigned at Trawniki included construction, maintenance, agricultural work, and logistical support functions that sustained the camp's infrastructure, reinforcing the link between forced labor and institutional development. And this arrangement meant that Jewish prisoners contributed directly to maintaining the physical environment in which auxiliary guards were being trained, highlighting the stark contrast between those coerced into labor and those prepared for roles within the machinery of repression. And SS personnel oversaw both sections, reinforcing administrative continuity while preserving spatial separation, and the proximity of these groups within the same perimeter illustrates how Trawniki functioned as a microcosm of the broader system, where exploitation, indoctrination, and preparation intersected in a single location. And as Operation Reinhard intensified in 1942, the prisoner population at Trawniki expanded with the arrival of Jews from nearby ghettos, embedding the camp within the deportation network that linked Lublin to extermination centers. And although Trawniki was not primarily a killing site in the manner of Belzec or Treblinka, its prisoner section nonetheless existed within the same structural logic of segregation and control that defined the Holocaust, and the routine visibility of auxiliary recruits training within sight of prisoner barracks underscores the institutional layering that characterized the camp, where preparation for mass murder occurred alongside the ongoing confinement of those already subjected to forced labor. And examining this coexistence clarifies that Trawniki cannot be understood solely as a training facility, because its labor function and prisoner population were integral to its operation, embedding the camp within the continuum of persecution that extended from ghettoization to forced labor and ultimately to extermination. And as Chapter 3 continues, the focus on the prisoner section highlights the internal complexity of Trawniki, revealing how spatial organization reflected systemic hierarchy, and how the quiet fields of eastern Poland concealed a compound where preparation and coercion operated simultaneously under the same administrative authority. Chapter 3, Segment 4: Surveillance, Security Measures, and the Controlled Environment. The internal order of Trawniki depended not only on barracks and drill grounds, but on a carefully maintained system of surveillance and security that reinforced authority across both the training and prisoner sections of the camp, embedding the principles of observation and control into the physical and administrative structure of the compound. And although the surrounding landscape of eastern Poland appeared open and agricultural, within the fenced perimeter movement was regulated through patrol routes, guard posts, and designated entry points that ensured every individual inside remained subject to oversight, and the camp was enclosed by barbed wire fencing that defined its boundary clearly against the flat terrain, while watch positions were strategically placed to provide visibility across key areas, reinforcing the constant presence of authority even in the absence of monumental architecture. And patrol routines were established for auxiliary recruits under SS supervision, both as part of their training and as a practical measure to maintain order within the compound, illustrating how surveillance served dual purposes as instruction and enforcement. And access to the camp was controlled through guarded gates connected to the nearby railway line and local roads, embedding Trawniki within a network of movement that remained tightly regulated. And administrative protocols required documentation of arrivals, departures, and assignments, reinforcing the bureaucratic dimension of security alongside its physical expression. And the coexistence of prisoner barracks and training areas necessitated clear spatial separation, ensuring that interaction between groups was limited and that hierarchy remained visible, illustrating how the layout itself functioned as a tool of surveillance by delineating zones of authority and confinement, and the SS officers overseeing the camp emphasized discipline not only through instruction but through inspection, conducting regular reviews of guard readiness, barrack organization, and perimeter integrity, embedding evaluation into daily routine, and the quiet rural surroundings amplified the sense of enclosure within the compound, because beyond the fence lay open fields and villages. Yet the transition from civilian landscape to controlled camp space was immediate and unmistakable, reinforcing the boundary between occupation authority and the local environment, and examining these security measures clarifies that Trawniki operated as a tightly regulated institution despite its modest scale, reflecting the broader SS emphasis on structured oversight across all components of Operation Reinhard. And the railway connection once again played a role in security planning, as scheduled transports required coordination to prevent disruption or unauthorized movement, embedding logistical management within the framework of control. And as Chapter 3 progresses, this focus on surveillance reveals how the camp's design and daily practice were aligned to sustain authority, ensuring that both auxiliary trainees and Jewish prisoners existed within a system where visibility, documentation, and regulated movement reinforced the hierarchical order central to Trawnike's function behind the death camps. Chapter 3, Segment 5. Trawniki as a structured institutional space within the Reinhard network. By the height of Operation Reinhard in 1942 and into 1943, Trawniki had fully crystallized into a structured institutional space whose physical layout, internal routines, surveillance mechanisms, and dual populations were integrated into the broader machinery of genocide operating across the Lublin district, and understanding this structural maturity is essential because it reveals that the camp functioned not as a temporary improvisation but as an organized node within a coordinated network. And the coexistence of auxiliary training grounds, prisoner labor barracks, administrative offices, storage facilities, and security perimeters created a compound where each spatial element reinforced the others, embedding preparation, confinement, and deployment into a single operational system. And the railway connection ensured that Trawniki remained in constant interaction with extermination centers such as Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, as well as with ghettos undergoing liquidation, reinforcing the camp's outward reach beyond its rural boundaries, and the daily rhythm inside the compound reflected this integration, with auxiliary guards drilled and evaluated for assignment while Jewish prisoners maintained infrastructure and endured forced labor under strict supervision, illustrating how hierarchical layers operated simultaneously within the same fenced environment, and administrative reporting to Lublin offices sustained bureaucratic continuity, ensuring that training cycles, personnel numbers, and logistical needs were recorded and aligned with regional directives, embedding the camp within a documented chain of authority, and the presence of experienced SS officers overseeing both sections reinforced institutional consistency, linking Trawnike's procedures to established camp practices across occupied Poland, and examining the camp at this stage reveals how its modest physical scale concealed its strategic importance, because it supplied manpower essential to sustaining the tempo of extermination operations, demonstrating that genocide relied not only on killing sites but on structured preparation and personnel management behind them, and the quiet agricultural fields surrounding Trawniki stood in contrast to the disciplined interior order maintained within the perimeter, reinforcing the theme that ordinary geography often served as the foundation for extraordinary institutional function. And by 1943, as Operation Reinhard reached its culmination, Trawnike's identity as a training hub was firmly established, its name synonymous with the auxiliary guards deployed across multiple sites, embedding the camp permanently within the operational history of the Holocaust. And as Chapter 3 concludes, the focus on structure and spatial organization clarifies that Trawniki operated as a cohesive institutional space, where layout, routine, surveillance, and administrative oversight converged to sustain the machinery behind the death camps, demonstrating how preparation and persecution were interwoven within the same controlled environment in eastern Poland. Chapter 4, Segment 1. The role of Odilo Globoknik and regional SS leadership. To understand Trawniki fully in 1942 and 1943, it is necessary to move beyond the fences and barracks of the camp itself and examine the regional leadership structure that directed its purpose, because the transformation of Trawniki into the central training ground for auxiliary guards was not a local initiative but part of a coordinated plan shaped by SS and police leader Odilo Globoknik, whose office in Lublin functioned as the administrative center of Operation Reinhard, embedding Trawniki within a wider hierarchy that linked policy to implementation, and Globoknik's authority extended across the Lublin district, overseeing deportations, extermination centers, forced labor camps, and police units, illustrating how regional command consolidated multiple functions under a single coordinated framework, and within this structure Trawniki was designated as the primary site for organizing and training the non-German auxiliaries who would reinforce SS manpower at extermination camps, such as Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, reinforcing the strategic alignment between personnel preparation and killing operations, and the administrative relationship between Trawniki and Globoknik's office demonstrates the bureaucratic precision of the system, because recruitment, evaluation, assignment, and disciplinary oversight were managed through reporting channels that connected the camp to regional headquarters, ensuring that guard deployment corresponded with operational demands at extermination sites, and this hierarchical connection clarifies that Trawniki was not an independent institution but a structural component within the machinery of genocide, embedded in a command network that translated ideological directives into organized action, and Globoknik's office coordinated the allocation of resources, transportation schedules, and staffing needs, meaning that the presence of trained auxiliaries at extermination camps was directly linked to the throughput of training cycles at Trawniki, illustrating how regional leadership shaped local function, and examining this chain of authority reveals how the Holocaust depended on layered decision-making, where central policy directives were implemented through district-level planning and local execution, embedding Trawniki firmly within that continuum, and the rural quiet of eastern Poland concealed this administrative intensity, as decisions made in Lublin determined the pace at which recruits were trained, dispatched, and integrated into the Reinhard camps, reinforcing the interconnected nature of the system. And by situating Trawniki within Globoknik's command structure, we see clearly that its development was aligned with the expansion of extermination policy, demonstrating that preparation and killing were synchronized under unified regional leadership rather than operating in isolation. And as Chapter 4 begins, this focus on SS authority underscores that Trawnike's significance lies not only in its internal routines but in the command network that directed its evolution, embedding the camp within the organized hierarchy that sustained Operation Reinhard across occupied Poland. Chapter 4, Segment 2. Camp Commandants and the Direct Oversight of Trawniki. While regional authority under Odilo Globoknik shaped the broader strategic direction of Operation Reinhard, the daily function and internal discipline of Trawniki depended upon the German SS officers assigned directly to command the camp, and examining this layer of leadership reveals how centralized policy was translated into structured routine within the fenced compound, embedding administrative intention into daily operation, and the camp commandants at Trawniki were responsible not only for supervising the training of auxiliary recruits but also for managing the Jewish prisoner labor section, coordinating logistics, maintaining security, and reporting personnel numbers and developments back to Lublin, reinforcing the camp's integration within the wider SS hierarchy, and these officers operated within a clearly defined chain of command, receiving directives from regional leadership while exercising authority over subordinate SS staff and auxiliary unit leaders, illustrating how layered supervision ensured institutional continuity, and the commandants oversaw recruitment processing, organized training cycles, approved deployment lists, and enforced disciplinary measures among both trainees and prisoners, embedding control mechanisms into every aspect of camp life, and documentation played a central role in this oversight, as personnel files, assignment rosters, and transfer orders were recorded to maintain administrative accuracy, demonstrating that even a rural training compound functioned through bureaucratic precision, and the leadership style emphasized discipline, obedience, and efficiency, aligning Trawnike's internal culture with broader SS institutional norms observed across concentration camps and police formations. And the commandants also maintained liaison with extermination camp authorities to coordinate the arrival of trained auxiliaries, ensuring that manpower distribution matched operational demands at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, reinforcing the camp's outward influence, and within the perimeter, their authority was visible through inspections, roll calls, and enforcement of training standards, embedding hierarchy into the physical environment described earlier, and the coexistence of guard trainees and forced labor prisoners required structured separation and oversight, further emphasizing the commandant's role in maintaining order across dual populations. And examining this direct leadership layer clarifies that Trawniki functioned not merely as a logistical site but as a disciplined institutional space governed by officers who translated regional objectives into daily practice, reinforcing the systemic character of the machinery behind the death camps. And as Chapter 4 continues, the focus on camp commandants underscores that the transformation of Soviet POW recruits into auxiliary guards and the maintenance of prisoner labor were both products of deliberate oversight, embedding Trawniki within a coherent administrative framework rather than allowing it to operate as a peripheral or improvised facility within Operation Reinhard. Chapter 4, Segment 3. The relationship between Trawniki and the extermination camp command structure. To understand the full administrative function of Trawniki, it is necessary to examine how its leadership intersected with the command structures of the extermination camps that formed the core of Operation Reinhard, because Trawniki did not operate as an isolated training facility but as a personnel hub directly linked to Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, embedding its internal processes within a broader network of coordinated authority, and this relationship was structured through formal reporting channels, assignment documentation, and direct communication between camp commandants, ensuring that the supply of trained auxiliaries matched the operational needs of extermination sites experiencing continuous deportation transports. And when extermination camp commandants required additional guards to maintain perimeter security, escort incoming transports, or supervise prisoner labor details within their compounds, requests were relayed through the Lublin district leadership, which then coordinated with Trawniki to dispatch appropriately trained units, illustrating how administrative synchronization supported the tempo of mass murder. And this flow of personnel reinforced the layered hierarchy of the system, as auxiliary guards remained subordinate to German SS officers at extermination camps, yet their initial training and organization were rooted in Trawniki's structured environment, creating a direct institutional link between preparation and execution. And documentation accompanying transfers ensured that each deployment was recorded, embedding bureaucratic continuity across sites, and the personnel circulated between camps when necessary, returning for reassignment or further instruction, reinforcing the dynamic nature of the training hub. And this interconnection reveals how Operation Reinhard relied on a coordinated network rather than on independently functioning camps, demonstrating that the machinery of genocide was sustained through logistical alignment between leadership offices, training compounds, and killing centers, and the commandants at extermination camps depended upon the auxiliary manpower generated at Trawniki to compensate for limited German SS staffing, highlighting the practical necessity of this relationship within the broader system. And by analyzing these administrative ties, we see clearly that Trawniki was woven into the command fabric of Reinhard operations, its daily routines calibrated to support the needs of extermination sites beyond its perimeter, and the rural quiet of the training compound masked the intensity of communication and coordination, linking it to camps where deportation transports arrived daily, reinforcing the systemic integration that defined the Holocaust's operational phase in occupied Poland. And as Chapter 4 continues, this focus on intercamp relationships clarifies that Trawniki's significance rests not only in its internal leadership but in its structural alignment with extermination camp command structures, embedding it firmly within the organized hierarchy that sustained mass murder during 1942 and 1943. Chapter 4, Segment 4. Administrative documentation, personnel records, and bureaucratic precision. The effectiveness of Trawniki as a training and deployment center depended not only on physical infrastructure and command hierarchy, but on the bureaucratic precision that governed its daily function, because within the SS system documentation served as both a tool of organization and a mechanism of accountability, embedding each recruit, assignment, and transfer within a written record that linked the camp to regional leadership in Lublin, and personnel files were created for auxiliary guards. Processed through Trawniki, noting identification details, training completion status, disciplinary actions, and deployment destinations, illustrating how administrative tracking reinforced institutional control, and these records ensured that manpower allocation across Operation Reinhard camps remained coordinated, enabling extermination centers such as Belzec, Sobibór, and Treblinka to request and receive reinforcements through established reporting channels and the presence of standardized forms, assignment rosters, and transport lists demonstrates that even a rural training compound operated within a highly organized paperwork culture characteristic of the SS, reinforcing the argument that genocide was sustained through structured bureaucracy as much as through ideology, and the commandants and administrative staff at Trawniki were responsible for maintaining these records accurately, submitting updates to district offices, and ensuring that each deployment aligned with operational directives issued by WWII's headquarters, embedding the camp within a chain of documentation that connected preparation sites to killing centers, and beyond guard records. Documentation extended to supply inventories, barrack assignments, and prisoner labor rosters, reflecting the dual function of the camp as both training facility and labor installation, and this bureaucratic dimension reveals how routine paperwork normalized extraordinary actions, transforming recruitment and deployment into standard administrative processes within the SS system, and examining the surviving fragments of these records allows historians to reconstruct the scale of the auxiliary program, identifying the movement of Trawniki-trained guards across multiple sites and clarifying the systemic integration between camps, and the quiet agricultural surroundings of eastern Poland concealed this intensive record-keeping activity, as inside the compound clerks and officers compiled lists that would determine the flow of personnel sustaining Operation Reinhard, reinforcing that the machinery behind the death camps was coordinated through meticulous organization. And by focusing on administrative documentation, we see clearly that Trawnike's role was embedded within a broader bureaucratic architecture, where precision, hierarchy, and reporting structured the preparation of guards just as systematically as extermination centers structured the arrival of deportation transports. And as Chapter 4 progresses, this emphasis on paperwork and record-keeping underscores that the camp's influence extended through documented channels, embedding its function within the larger administrative logic that defined the Holocaust's operational phase in occupied Poland. Chapter 4, Segment 5. Institutional Stability and the Consolidation of Authority in 1942 to 1943. By late 1942 and into 1943, Trawniki had reached a phase of institutional stability in which its leadership hierarchy, administrative procedures, training cycles, and deployment patterns operated with structured regularity, embedding the camp firmly within the functioning core of Operation Reinhard rather than at its margins. And this period of consolidation illustrates how the SS system transformed an improvised recruitment solution into a stable component of genocidal infrastructure, reinforcing continuity between regional command in Lublin and the extermination centers supplied by Trawniki-trained auxiliaries, and the chain of authority, from WWII's district office to camp commandants and subordinate SS instructors, remained clearly defined, ensuring that directives were transmitted efficiently and that performance expectations for auxiliary guards were standardized across deployments, embedding consistency into the human network sustaining the death camps. And, during this phase, Trawniki functioned with predictable cycles: recruitment intake, structured instruction, evaluation, and dispatch, followed by replacement training as manpower demands continued, illustrating how the camp operated as a revolving institutional mechanism aligned with the tempo of deportations and extermination, and the administrative documentation described previously supported this stability, as personnel records, transport lists, and assignment rosters created a continuous feedback loop between preparation and execution sites, reinforcing bureaucratic coherence even as operations intensified, and the coexistence of prisoner labor within the compound further stabilized its infrastructure, ensuring that barracks maintenance, logistical support, and construction needs were met internally, embedding functional self-sufficiency within the camp's design. And the relative regularity of this period contrasts with the earlier transitional phase of 1941, demonstrating that Trawniki had fully matured into a central training hub whose procedures were embedded within the broader SS institutional culture, and the quiet rural setting masked this operational steadiness. As trains continued to connect the camp with Lublin and beyond, transporting trained auxiliaries to camps where extermination activities were ongoing, reinforcing the integration of personnel preparation with mass murder logistics, and examining this consolidation phase clarifies that Trawniki's role was not incidental or temporary but stabilized through deliberate administrative structuring, illustrating how genocide depended on sustained institutional order rather than chaotic improvisation. And as Chapter 4 concludes, the focus on stability and authority underscores that Trawniki operated as a disciplined and enduring node within Operation Reinhard during its most active period, embedding its leadership, paperwork, and training routines within the systemic framework that sustained the machinery behind the death camps across occupied Poland. Chapter 5, Segment 1. The Jewish prisoner population at Trawniki and forced labor structures. While Trawniki is most widely remembered for its role as a training ground for auxiliary guards, the camp also functioned as a significant site of Jewish forced labor, and understanding the structure and experience of this prisoner population is essential to presenting a complete history of the camp, because the coexistence of guard training and labor exploitation within the same fence compound reveals the layered hierarchy that defined its operation, embedding preparation for extermination. Alongside the ongoing confinement and coercion of Jewish detainees, and beginning in 1940 and expanding through 1942 and 1943, Jews from nearby towns, ghettos in the Lublin district, and later deportees from other regions were transported to Trawniki to perform labor under SS supervision, reinforcing the integration of the camp within the broader occupation policy that sought both to isolate and exploit Jewish communities. And the prisoner section of the camp consisted of overcrowded wooden barracks arranged in rows, separated spatially from the auxiliary training grounds yet enclosed within the same perimeter, illustrating the structural duality embedded in Trawniki's design. And daily life for prisoners followed a regulated rhythm of roll calls, assigned work details, ration distribution, and surveillance, reinforcing the system of control characteristic of forced labor camps throughout occupied Poland. And labor assignments included construction work to expand camp facilities, maintenance of barracks and infrastructure, agricultural tasks in surrounding fields, and logistical duties that supported the camp's operations, embedding the prisoner population directly into the physical maintenance of the institution that trained guards for extermination centers. And the presence of Jewish laborers within Trawniki highlights the functional interdependence between coercion and preparation, because the infrastructure that enabled auxiliary training was sustained through forced labor, illustrating how the camp's dual roles were interconnected rather than separate. And as Operation Reinhard intensified, prisoner numbers fluctuated with the arrival of transports from liquidated ghettos, embedding Trawniki within the deportation network that reshaped the Lublin district. And although Trawniki was not designed primarily as a killing center in the manner of Belzec or Treblinka, its prisoner population existed under the same overarching genocidal policy framework. Facing uncertainty as deportations and camp closures accelerated in 1943, and examining the structure of forced labor at Trawniki clarifies that the camp's history cannot be reduced solely to its auxiliary training function, because the Jewish prisoners confined their experience the daily reality of exploitation, surveillance, and vulnerability that defined the broader system, and the rural quiet of eastern Poland once again contrasts with the regulated existence within the fenced compound, where preparation and persecution unfolded simultaneously under the authority of SS leadership. And as Chapter 5 begins, this focus on the prisoner population underscores the complexity of Trawnike's identity, revealing how labor structures and training operations coexisted within a single institutional space embedded in the machinery behind the death camps. Chapter 5, Segment 2: Economic Function, Workshops, and the Camp's Industrial Role. As Trawniki expanded in 1942 and 1943, its Jewish prisoner population was increasingly integrated into structured labor systems that extended beyond basic maintenance, embedding the camp within the broader economic exploitation policies implemented throughout the Lublin district under SS authority. And although the site never developed into a large industrial complex comparable to camps such as Majdanek, it nonetheless housed workshops and labor details that served regional logistical needs, reinforcing the functional relationship between forced labor and administrative infrastructure. And within the prisoner section, designated work areas were established for tasks such as tailoring, shoemaking, carpentry, and repair work, illustrating how specialized skills among detainees were organized to support SS units and nearby facilities. And these workshops operated under supervision, with production quotas and schedules determined by camp leadership, embedding labor discipline into daily routine. And the economic function of Trawniki was also linked to agricultural work in surrounding fields, as prisoners were assigned to cultivate crops or perform seasonal labor that supplemented supply needs, reinforcing the integration of the camp within the rural environment that initially defined the settlement. And this combination of workshop activity and field labor illustrates the hybrid character of Trawniki as both training facility and labor camp, where exploitation and preparation coexisted structurally within the same perimeter, and the revenue or material output generated through these labor assignments was absorbed into the SS economic network operating in occupied Poland, demonstrating how camps were incorporated into a broader system of extraction that aligned ideological persecution with material benefit, and administrative records documented labor assignments and workshop productivity, reinforcing the bureaucratic oversight described earlier. And the coexistence of economic exploitation with auxiliary training underscores the multilayered function of Trawniki, where the camp's identity extended beyond personnel preparation into sustained labor utilization, embedding it further into the institutional framework of the Lublin district. And examining this industrial and workshop dimension clarifies that the camp's infrastructure relied upon structured labor to maintain operational stability, reinforcing that even as auxiliary guards were prepared for deployment to extermination centers, Jewish prisoners were compelled to sustain the camp's physical and economic framework through enforced productivity, and the quiet rural setting masked this economic activity, as inside the compound sewing machines, carpentry benches, and agricultural tools formed part of a controlled labor system integrated into the machinery behind Operation Reinhard. And as Chapter 5 continues, this focus on workshops and economic role reveals how Trawniki functioned simultaneously as a training hub and as a site of systematic labor exploitation, embedding both functions within the broader administrative logic of SS governance in occupied Poland. Chapter 5, Segment 3: Living Conditions, Rations, and the Structure of Daily Survival. Within the prisoner section of Trawniki, daily existence was shaped not only by forced labor assignments but by the physical conditions of confinement, embedding survival itself within the structured hierarchy of the camp. And although Trawniki was not constructed as a large extermination center in the manner of Belzec or Treblinka, the living conditions experienced by Jewish prisoners reflected the broader patterns of deprivation characteristic of forced labor camps in the Lublin district, reinforcing the systemic nature of persecution even in sites not primarily designated for killing. And the wooden barracks that housed prisoners were often overcrowded, with limited insulation against seasonal weather, illustrating how spatial compression intensified hardship within a rural compound originally designed for agricultural purposes rather than mass confinement. And sleeping arrangements typically consisted of tiered bunks or shared platforms, emphasizing the density of occupancy. and the absence of privacy, embedding physical constraint into daily routine, and rations were distributed according to standardized camp schedules, consisting of minimal bread portions, thin soup, and limited supplementary food, reinforcing dependence on administrative allocation and highlighting how nutritional control functioned as a mechanism of regulation, and the distribution process itself was supervised by guards and prisoner functionaries, embedding hierarchy even within the act of. Sustenance and sanitation facilities were basic, often inadequate for the size of the population, illustrating how infrastructural limitations compounded the strain of forced labor, and access to medical care was limited and subject to oversight, reflecting the broader pattern in which health was subordinated to labor capacity and administrative priorities. And despite these constraints, prisoners organized internal support networks within barracks when possible, sharing information, ration portions, or assistance in coping with daily hardship, demonstrating the human dimension that persisted within structured oppression. And the coexistence of auxiliary guard training grounds nearby created a stark contrast within the same perimeter, as those being prepared to enforce policies elsewhere lived in separate quarters while Jewish prisoners navigated the routines of survival under constant supervision, reinforcing the layered hierarchy embedded in Trawniki's design. And examining living conditions clarifies that the camp's role in the machinery behind the death camps cannot be separated from the lived experience of those confined within it, because exploitation, deprivation, and uncertainty formed the environment in which preparation for extermination unfolded, and the quiet agricultural fields surrounding Trawniki masked these internal conditions. As beyond the fence the landscape appeared calm, yet inside the compound daily survival was regulated by ration schedules, labor demands, and surveillance protocols, embedding within the rural setting a structured system of control that defined the prisoner experience. And as Chapter 5 continues, this focus on living conditions underscores the complex identity of Trawniki as both a training center and a labor camp, revealing how the architecture of preparation and the architecture of deprivation operated side by side within the same institutional space in Eastern Poland. Chapter 5, Segment 4. Expansion of the prisoner population and the impact of ghetto liquidations. As 1942 progressed and Operation Reinhard intensified across the Lublin district and beyond, the prisoner population at Trawniki expanded in direct connection with the liquidation of nearby ghettos, embedding the camp more deeply into the deportation network that reshaped Jewish life in occupied Poland. And this expansion reflected a broader structural pattern in which labor camps absorbed selected groups of Jews deemed temporarily useful for forced work while the majority of deportees were sent directly to extermination centers, illustrating how Trawniki functioned within a layered system of selection, exploitation, and eventual destruction, and transports from ghettos in Lublin, Chelm, and surrounding towns brought new detainees into the camp's fenced perimeter, increasing overcrowding within the prisoner barracks and intensifying labor demands as infrastructure and workshop activity expanded, and the railway connection once again played a decisive role, as the same transportation network that carried deportees toward Belzec or Sobibor also delivered labor contingents to Trawniki, reinforcing the logistical integration of the camp within Operation Reinhard. And the arrival of these prisoners altered the internal dynamic of the camp, as individuals who had experienced ghetto confinement now faced the structured routines of forced labor under SS supervision, embedding within Trawniki the broader trajectory of persecution unfolding across Eastern Poland. And administrative selection processes determined which deportees were retained for labor and which were transferred onward, illustrating how decisions about life and death were embedded within bureaucratic procedures rather than spontaneous actions. And the increased population placed additional strain on living conditions described earlier, intensifying overcrowding, ration distribution challenges, and sanitation limitations, reinforcing the structural hardship that defined the camp's prisoner section. And at the same time auxiliary guard training continued within adjacent zones, underscoring the coexistence of preparation and exploitation as two synchronized functions within the same compound. And examining the impact of ghetto liquidations on Trawniki clarifies that the camp was not peripheral to Operation Reinhard but actively shaped by its tempo, as the dismantling of Jewish communities supplied both laborers and personnel demands across the district, embedding the rural settlement within the systemic destruction of Polish Jewry, and the quiet agricultural surroundings concealed this movement of people and policy. As inside the fence the arrival of transports signaled shifts in population and work assignments aligned with regional directives from Lublin, reinforcing the administrative continuity that linked Trawniki to extermination centers beyond its borders. And as Chapter 5 continues, the focus on population expansion reveals how the camp evolved in response to broader deportation policies, integrating forced labor structures into the wider genocidal framework that defined Operation Reinhard in 1942 and 1943. Chapter 5, Segment 5. The position of Trawniki within the labor extermination continuum. By late 1942 and into 1943, Trawniki occupied a clearly defined place within what historians describe as the labor extermination continuum of Operation Reinhard, a structured system in which forced labor camps, ghettos, and extermination centers operated not as isolated entities but as interconnected components within a coordinated policy framework. And examining Trawniki through this lens clarifies that its role cannot be reduced to a single function, because the camp simultaneously trained auxiliary guards for deployment to killing centers while confining Jewish prisoners for forced labor, embedding preparation and exploitation within one institutional space that fed directly into the machinery of genocide, and this continuum operated through administrative selection, transportation logistics, and personnel coordination, as deportees arriving from liquidated ghettos were assessed for labor capacity, some retained temporarily at camps like Trawniki, others sent onward to extermination sites, illustrating how survival at a labor camp often existed within a precarious and conditional structure defined by regional policy shifts, and the presence of auxiliary guard training within the same perimeter underscores the continuity between these phases, because the men drilled and organized at Trawniki would later supervise deportations, guard extermination camp perimeters, and enforce ghetto clearances, reinforcing the structural link between the camp's dual populations. And the railway line connecting Trawniki to Lublin and other district centers functioned as a physical artery within this continuum, transporting both prisoners and trained guards along routes that sustained the tempo of Operation Reinhard, embedding the rural settlement within a regional network of destruction, and administrative records maintained at the camp reflected this layered function, documenting prisoner labor rosters alongside guard deployment lists, illustrating how bureaucratic precision unified exploitation and extermination under one reporting framework, and the economic output generated through workshops and agricultural labor-supported SS infrastructure, while the auxiliary units trained on adjacent grounds reinforced manpower at extermination centers, demonstrating that Trawniki contributed both materially and structurally to the genocidal system, and understanding this dual contribution reveals why the camp stands as a critical node behind the death camps rather than as a peripheral installation, because it sustained the human and logistical resources necessary for the Reinhard camps to function at scale, and the quiet fields surrounding Trawniki conceal this historical complexity, as today little in the landscape suggests that within this fenced compound the continuum of labor and extermination was woven together through disciplined routine and administrative oversight. Yet, in 1942 and 1943, the camp operated precisely within that integrated framework, reinforcing the systemic character of the Holocaust in occupied Poland. And as Chapter 5 concludes, the focus on the labor extermination continuum underscores that Trawniki was not merely adjacent to the machinery of death but embedded within it, serving as both a site of forced labor and a generator of auxiliary personnel, whose deployment sustained the tempo and structure of Operation Reinhard across the Lublin district and beyond. Chapter 6, Segment 1. Operation Reinhard at its peak and Trawniki's central role. By the middle of 1942, Operation Reinhard had entered its most intense phase, as deportations from ghettos across occupied Poland accelerated and extermination centers at Belzec, Sobibór, and Treblinka operated at sustained capacity. And within this coordinated regional system, Trawniki stood not on the periphery but at the operational center of manpower preparation, embedding its training cycles directly into the tempo of mass deportation and extermination and the demand for auxiliary guards. Increased as transports arrive daily at the death camps, requiring perimeter control, escort supervision, and reinforcement of internal security structures, illustrating how the implementation of genocide depended not only on gas chambers and transport schedules, but on trained personnel capable of maintaining order across rapidly expanding operations, and Trawniki fulfilled this demand through structured recruitment, drill instruction, and administrative deployment coordinated under the authority of WWII's Lublin headquarters, reinforcing the integration of preparation and execution within a unified chain of command. And as deportations intensified during the summer and autumn of 1942, the flow of auxiliaries from Trawniki to extermination sites became more frequent, embedding the camp within the daily mechanics of Reinhard's peak phase, and this outward movement of personnel corresponded with inward shifts at the camp itself, as new recruits were processed, trained, and organized to replace those dispatched, illustrating the cyclical nature of the training system that sustained extermination infrastructure. And the railway network once again functioned as the logistical spine connecting Trawniki to killing centers, allowing rapid transfer of guards in alignment with deportation schedules determined at regional offices, reinforcing that genocide unfolded through synchronized mobility rather than isolated acts, and the coexistence of Jewish forced labor. Within the same compound added another layer to this peak period, as prisoners maintained workshops and infrastructure even while auxiliary units prepared for deployment, demonstrating how exploitation and preparation continued in parallel, and examining Trawniki during this phase reveals the scale of its structural contribution, because without the auxiliary manpower it supplied, extermination camps operating under limited German SS staff would have faced operational strain, highlighting the practical necessity of the training hub within the Reinhard system, and the quiet agricultural landscape surrounding the camp masked this intensity, as inside the fenced perimeter drill formations, administrative documentation, and labor routines unfolded in disciplined sequence, embedding Trawniki firmly within the machinery of destruction at the very moment when Operation Reinhard reached its highest tempo. And as Chapter 6 begins, the focus on this peak phase underscores that Trawniki was not a passive backdrop but an active generator of personnel and structure, sustaining the human infrastructure that enabled extermination centers to operate with systematic efficiency across occupied Poland. Chapter 6, Segment 2. Guard participation in deportations and ghetto liquidations. As Operation Reinhard intensified throughout 1942, the auxiliary guards trained at Trawniki were increasingly deployed not only within extermination camp perimeters but also during the process of deportation itself, embedding the camp's influence directly into the dismantling of Jewish communities across the Lublin district and beyond. And this role reveals the structural continuity between training grounds and field operations, because the men instructed in patrol formation, weapons handling, and crowd control at Trawniki were assigned to assist in ghetto liquidations, escort deportation columns to railway stations, and secure transport trains bound for extermination centers, illustrating how preparation translated into operational participation within the broader machinery of genocide. And these actions were coordinated through regional SS and police commands under WWII's authority, reinforcing that the deployment of Trawniki-trained auxiliaries was synchronized with district-wide deportation schedules rather than improvised at local levels, and the railway infrastructure once again connected Trawniki to the unfolding process, as guards trained in the rural compound traveled outward to towns undergoing liquidation, reinforcing the link between the training facility and the destruction of urban Jewish life. And documentation accompanying these deployments reflected the bureaucratic nature of the system, as guard assignments, dates, and transport coordination were recorded through administrative channels, embedding violence within structured paperwork rather than spontaneous chaos. And within ghettos targeted for liquidation, auxiliary units supported German SS officers by establishing cordons, monitoring movement, and ensuring that deportees were directed toward assembly points, demonstrating how Trawnike's training curriculum prepared personnel for enforcement roles integral to Reinhard operations and the cyclical pattern of deployment and return. reinforced the camp's identity as a personnel hub, as some auxiliaries rotated between field assignments and the training compound, sustaining institutional continuity, and examining this participation clarifies that Trawnike's significance extended beyond the boundaries of its fence, because the actions of its trained guards shaped the experience of deportation and transport across multiple communities, embedding the camp's structural influence within the lived trajectory of Jewish victims. From ghetto confinement to extermination, and the rural quiet of Trawniki contrasts sharply with the intensity of operations in the towns where its auxiliaries were dispatched, reinforcing the theme that preparation sites and execution sites were interdependent within the Reinhard framework. And as Chapter 6 continues, this focus on deportation and liquidation roles underscores how Trawniki functioned as an active contributor to the operational phase of genocide, supplying trained manpower that sustained both the logistical and enforcement dimensions of Operation Reinhard at its peak. Chapter 6, Segment 3. Rotation, Reassignment, and the Circulation of Auxiliary Personnel. As Operation Reinhard progressed through its most intense period in late 1942 and into 1943, the movement of auxiliary guards between Trawniki and various extermination and labor sites became increasingly structured, illustrating that the training camp functioned not as a one-time processing center but as part of a circulating personnel system embedded within the broader SS apparatus, and examining this rotation reveals how manpower management contributed to the continuity and stability of genocidal operations, because auxiliaries trained at Trawniki were not permanently assigned to a single site in all cases, but often experienced reassignment based on operational needs, performance evaluations, or shifting district priorities, reinforcing the dynamic nature of the Reinhard network. And this circulation was coordinated through administrative channels in Lublin, where reports from extermination camps and ghetto actions informed decisions about reinforcement, replacement, or disciplinary transfer, embedding Trawniki within an ongoing feedback loop between preparation and field execution, and the railway infrastructure facilitated these movements, allowing trained units to be dispatched rapidly to camps such as Sobibor or Treblinka and, when necessary, redirected to labor camps or security duties elsewhere in occupied Poland, illustrating how logistical mobility supported institutional adaptability, and within Trawniki itself, returning auxiliaries could be integrated into new training cycles, providing practical reinforcement to incoming recruits while undergoing evaluation by SS officers responsible for maintaining discipline and cohesion, reinforcing the hierarchical structure described earlier. And this system of reassignment also allowed regional command to respond to fluctuations in deportation schedules, ensuring that extermination camps experiencing heightened transport arrivals received sufficient guard manpower, while quieter periods allowed for consolidation and retraining, embedding operational flexibility within a bureaucratically organized framework. And examining the circulation of personnel clarifies that Trawniki was both a source and a stabilizing node within the Reinhard system, because its ability to absorb, retrain, and redeploy auxiliaries sustained the human infrastructure necessary for continued operation across multiple sites, and the coexistence of forced labor within the camp persisted during this period, underscoring that the structural duality of Trawniki, training and exploitation, remained intact even as personnel flowed outward and inward, reinforcing its identity as a dynamic institutional hub rather than a static facility. And the rural fields surrounding the compound concealed this constant movement, as trains quietly carried men trained in eastern Poland to distant camps where deportations were underway, linking the calm exterior landscape to the wider geography of destruction. And as Chapter 6 continues, this focus on rotation and reassignment highlights the systemic coordination that underpinned Operation Reinhard, demonstrating that genocide relied on organized personnel circulation just as much as on centralized planning, and that Trawniki stood at the heart of this circulation, sustaining the machinery behind the death camps through disciplined mobility and administrative continuity. Chapter 6, Segment 4. 1943 Transitions and the Shifting Role of Trawniki. By early 1943, the operational landscape of Operation Reinhard began to change, and with it the role of Trawniki evolved in response to shifting regional priorities, embedding the camp within a transitional phase that marked the gradual dismantling of extermination centers even as forced labor and security functions persisted, and the closure of Belzec in late 1942 and the uprisings at Treblinka and Sobibór later in 1943 altered the tempo of deportations, signaling that the most intense phase of Reinhard was drawing toward conclusion. Yet this did not render Trawniki obsolete, because the infrastructure and trained auxiliary personnel it produced remained integrated within broader SS operations across occupied Poland, reinforcing the camp's adaptability within a changing administrative environment. And as extermination camps were dismantled or reduced, auxiliary guards were reassigned to other duties including labor camp supervision, anti-partisan operations, and security enforcement within the general government, illustrating how manpower trained for Reinhard could be redeployed within the larger apparatus of occupation control, and Trawniki itself continued to function as both a training and labor site during this period, though the emphasis shifted gradually from direct support of extermination centers towards sustaining security and forced labor structures in a region increasingly affected by resistance activity and German defensive concerns, embedding the camp within the broader wartime trajectory of 1943, and administrative reporting to Lublin adapted accordingly, documenting changes in deployment patterns and personnel assignments, reinforcing the bureaucratic continuity that characterized the SS system even as its objectives evolved, and the railway line that once carried auxiliaries to Reinhard camps now facilitated transfers to labor installations or other security roles, demonstrating that the logistical framework remained intact despite operational shifts. And within the prisoner section of Trawniki, forced labor continued under deteriorating conditions as regional ghettos were eliminated and Jewish populations drastically reduced, underscoring the narrowing horizon of survival within the camp. And examining this transitional year clarifies that Trawniki's significance extended beyond the peak of extermination activity, because its trained auxiliaries and institutional structures remained embedded within the ongoing occupation regime, reinforcing the idea that the camp was part of a sustained administrative network rather than a single-purpose facility tied exclusively to Reinhard's most lethal months. And the quiet agricultural surroundings again masked the intensity of these adjustments, as inside the fenced perimeter new directives reshaped routines, deployments, and expectations in alignment with a war that was turning gradually against Germany. And as Chapter 6 continues, this focus on 1943 transitions underscores how Trawniki adapted within a shifting landscape, maintaining structured authority and personnel coordination even as the extermination phase it had supported began to wind down, embedding the camp within the broader evolution of Nazi policy in occupied Poland during the middle years of the war. Chapter 6, Segment 5. The November 1943 mass shooting at Trawniki and Operation Harvest Festival. In early November 1943, the trajectory of Trawniki shifted decisively when SS leadership initiated a coordinated action across the Lublin district known as Operation Harvest Festival, an operation designed to eliminate the remaining Jewish forced labor populations in camps that had previously been integrated into the labor extermination continuum of Operation Reinhard. And within this broader district-wide action, Trawniki became one of the principal sites where mass shootings were carried out over a concentrated period of time, embedding the camp directly into the final stage of organized killing in the region. And the decision to conduct these coordinated shootings reflected both security concerns following resistance activity at Sobibor and Treblinka, and the broader objective of eliminating surviving Jewish labor contingents that had been retained temporarily for economic purposes, illustrating how policy priorities could shift rapidly from exploitation to annihilation within the same institutional framework. And at Trawniki, Jewish prisoners were assembled under guard supervision and taken to prepared execution sites within or near the campgrounds, where large numbers were killed in a systematic and organized manner, reinforcing the administrative coordination that characterized the operation. And this event marked a tragic culmination of the camp's dual identity, because the forced labor population that had sustained workshops and infrastructure was eradicated in a single concentrated action, underscoring the precariousness of survival within labor camps once regional directives changed. and the operation was synchronized with similar shootings at Majdanek and Poniatowa, demonstrating that Trawnike's role was embedded within a district-wide plan executed under SS command authority in Lublin, and the scale of the killings at Trawniki represented one of the largest single mass shootings carried out during Operation Harvest Festival, embedding the camp within the broader historical record of the Holocaust's final phase in the general government, and examining this event clarifies that Trawnike's history cannot be understood solely through its function as a training hub for auxiliary guards, because its prisoner population ultimately became direct victims of the same genocidal system that the camp helped sustain, reinforcing the structural interconnection between preparation, exploitation, and extermination, and after the shootings, the character of Trawniki shifted again, as the Jewish labor presence that had defined much of its daily operation was extinguished, leaving behind the auxiliary training function and residual administrative infrastructure, illustrating how the camp's identity evolved under changing policy conditions, and the rural fields surrounding Trawniki once more concealed a moment of immense violence carried out under organized authority, embedding the quiet landscape within the final consolidation of extermination policy in 1943, and as Chapter 6 concludes, the focus on Operation Harvest Festival underscores that Trawniki stands not only as a site behind the death camps but also as a location where mass killing occurred directly, marking the end of its labor population and situating the camp firmly within the closing chapter of organized genocide in the Lublin district. Chapter 7, Segment 1. The Aftermath of Operation Harvest Festival and Structural Contraction. Following the coordinated mass shootings of November 1943 carried out under Operation Harvest Festival, Trawniki entered a new and diminished phase in its institutional life, because the elimination of its Jewish forced labor population removed one of the two foundational components that had defined the camp's dual structure, embedding the site within a period of structural contraction rather than expansion, and the workshops, agricultural labor details, and maintenance functions that had depended upon prisoner labor were abruptly disrupted, leaving behind infrastructure that had once been sustained through coercion but now stood partially redundant, illustrating how policy shifts within the SS apparatus could rapidly alter the internal balance of a camp, and this transformation did not signal immediate closure, however, because the auxiliary training function and broader security role continued to operate within the compound, reinforcing the camp's integration within ongoing occupation authority even as extermination centers were dismantled or repurposed, and the command structure that had overseen both training and labor adapted to the new circumstances, consolidating personnel oversight while recalibrating daily routines in the absence of a large prisoner population, illustrating the administrative flexibility embedded within SS institutional culture, and the railway line that once transported Jewish detainees and auxiliary recruits continued to function as a logistical link for personnel movement, embedding Trawniki within the shifting geography of late 1943 security operations, and some auxiliary guards previously deployed to extermination centers were reassigned to labor camps, anti-partisan actions, or other policing roles within the general government, demonstrating how manpower trained at Trawniki remained embedded within the broader enforcement structure even as Operation Reinhard concluded, and within the camp grounds the physical traces of the mass shootings lingered in the landscape, though official documentation minimized or reframed events within bureaucratic language, reinforcing the distance between administrative record and lived reality, and examining this aftermath reveals that Trawniki did not dissolve into inactivity but contracted into a narrower institutional role aligned with evolving wartime priorities, illustrating how genocide infrastructure could transition into security infrastructure without dismantling its hierarchical framework, and the quiet rural surroundings again masked these internal adjustments, as the agricultural fields returned to seasonal rhythm while inside the compound authority recalibrated routines and reassigned personnel in accordance with directives from Lublin and higher SS leadership, reinforcing that Trawnike's significance persisted even after the elimination of its labor population. And as Chapter 7 begins, this focus on structural contraction clarifies that the camp's history extends beyond its peak and its most lethal episode, demonstrating how institutional systems adapt under changing policy conditions while preserving core elements of hierarchy, discipline, and administrative continuity within the broader machinery of occupation. Chapter 7, Segment 2. Auxiliary units after Reinhard and integration into broader SS operations. After the conclusion of Operation Reinhard and the mass shootings carried out during Operation Harvest Festival in November 1943, the auxiliary guards associated with Trawniki did not simply disappear from the administrative landscape, but were gradually absorbed into other branches of SS and police activity across occupied Poland and beyond, embedding the legacy of the training camp within the broader security apparatus of the German occupation as the war entered a new phase. And this integration reflects the structural adaptability of the SS system, which repurposed trained manpower according to evolving military and political needs, illustrating that Trawnike's function as a personnel generator extended beyond the extermination centers it had once supplied, and many auxiliary guards were reassigned to labor camps that continued operating in the general government, where they supervised remaining prisoner populations under tightening security conditions, reinforcing the continuity between earlier Reinhard duties and later enforcement roles, while others were deployed in anti-partisan operations aimed at suppressing resistance movements in rural districts, demonstrating how training in surveillance, perimeter control, and armed supervision translated into broader policing functions, and this reassignment process was coordinated through administrative channels that maintained records of personnel status and deployment, embedding bureaucratic oversight within the transition from extermination support to security enforcement. And the camp at Trawniki itself, though diminished in its original dual structure, remained a point of administrative reference for some of these personnel shifts, reinforcing its identity as an institutional node rather than a transient installation. And examining the post-Reinhard trajectory of the auxiliary units clarifies that their role within the occupation system evolved rather than ended, illustrating how the machinery behind the death camps transformed into mechanisms of control and repression as the war progressed, and the rural landscape surrounding Trawniki once again concealed this process, as the fields and railway lines appeared unchanged while trained units circulated outward under new assignments aligned with defensive and security priorities in 1944, reinforcing that institutional continuity persisted even as extermination operations wound down, and by situating the auxiliary guards within this broader operational shift, we see how Trawniki's influence extended into the later stages of German occupation policy, embedding its training legacy within a continuum of enforcement that stretched from ghetto liquidation to anti-partisan campaigns and labor camp supervision. And as Chapter 7 continues, this focus on integration underscores that Trawniki's historical significance did not end with the closure of Operation Reinhard but remained embedded within the evolving structure of SS authority during the final years of the war in occupied Poland. Chapter 7, Segment 3. 1944 Reorganization, Decline of Central Authority, and Shifting Front Lines. As 1944 began and the Eastern Front moved steadily westward under the pressure of Soviet military advances, the administrative environment surrounding Trawniki changed again, embedding the camp within a broader context of defensive reorganization and territorial contraction that affected SS installations throughout occupied Poland, and by this stage Operation Reinhard had concluded. Extermination centers in the Lublin district had been dismantled or concealed, and the primary focus of German occupation authorities shifted toward delaying Soviet advance, suppressing resistance, and reorganizing labor resources in preparation for retreat, illustrating how strategic priorities altered the function of camps once central to genocidal operations. And Trawniki, which had already experienced contraction following Operation Harvest Festival, now existed within a region facing imminent military threat, reinforcing the urgency of administrative adjustments. And some auxiliary personnel associated with the camp were reassigned further west or integrated into other security formations as front lines approached, embedding the trained manpower within a broader defensive strategy that sought to maintain order during retreat. And the physical compound at Trawniki underwent further reduction, as facilities tied specifically to earlier training cycles or prisoner labor became redundant in the face of shifting priorities, illustrating how institutional infrastructure contracted under external pressure, and documentation practices, though still maintained, reflected growing uncertainty as communication lines between Lublin and subordinate camps became increasingly strained by wartime disruption, reinforcing the gradual erosion of centralized oversight that had once characterized the Reinhard period. And examining this phase reveals how Trawnike's role transitioned from active hub to diminishing administrative point within a collapsing regional structure, illustrating the vulnerability of even tightly organized systems when confronted with military reversal, and the quiet rural setting once again masked the strategic tension unfolding within the compound, as trains and roads that had once facilitated coordinated deployment now served retreat logistics and personnel transfers aligned with defensive objectives, embedding the camp within the final arc of German occupation in eastern Poland. And by mid-1944, as Soviet forces advanced into the Lublin district, the authority that had structured Trawnike's earlier operations weakened significantly, demonstrating how geopolitical shifts ultimately disrupted the institutional continuity that had sustained the camp during its peak years. And as Chapter 7 continues, this focus on reorganization and decline underscores that Trawnike's history is inseparable from the broader military trajectory of the war, illustrating how the same administrative structures that enabled genocide were gradually dismantled or abandoned as front lines moved westward, embedding the camp's final phase within the larger story of collapse and retreat across occupied Poland. Chapter 7, Segment 4: Evacuation, Abandonment, and the Physical Dissolution of the Camp. As Soviet forces advanced into eastern Poland in the summer of 1944, and the Lublin district fell within the path of the Red Army's offensive, the remaining German administrative structures connected to Trawniki entered their final phase, embedding the camp within the broader pattern of evacuation and abandonment that characterized the collapse of occupation authority across the region. And unlike extermination centers that had been dismantled earlier under directives to conceal evidence, Trawnike's dissolution unfolded within the context of military retreat rather than systematic erasure alone, illustrating how wartime urgency reshaped the method of closure, and auxiliary personnel still associated with the camp were reassigned or withdrawn westward as part of defensive redeployments, reinforcing the integration of Trawniki-trained manpower into retreat logistics, while administrative files and records were either removed, destroyed, or left fragmented as communication lines broke down, demonstrating the disruption of bureaucratic continuity that had once structured every aspect of the camp's operation. And the physical compound itself, its barracks, fences, drill grounds, and workshop remnants, was gradually vacated, marking the end of its active function as both training hub and labor site. And examining this evacuation phase reveals how institutional spaces that had once embodied administrative precision and disciplined routine could dissolve rapidly when the authority sustaining them collapsed, embedding Trawniki within the wider narrative of German withdrawal from occupied Poland. And the railway line that had once facilitated deployment of auxiliary guards and arrival of prisoner transports now served retreat movements and military logistics under urgent conditions, illustrating the shifting purpose of infrastructure within a changing strategic landscape. And as Soviet forces entered the region, the remaining traces of SS presence at Trawniki faded, leaving behind structures that bore silent witness to years of organized activity, and the rural landscape once again asserted its visual calm, though the ground retained the imprint of both training cycles and mass violence carried out during Operation Harvest Festival, reinforcing the contrast between surface appearance and historical depth. And by the time German authority withdrew entirely from the Lublin district, Trawniki had ceased to function as an institutional node within the SS system, its administrative chains severed and its personnel dispersed, demonstrating that even tightly coordinated structures depend upon sustained political and military power to operate. And as Chapter 7 continues, this focus on evacuation and physical dissolution underscores that Trawnike's operational life ended not through gradual transformation but through abrupt abandonment under advancing front lines, embedding the camp's final chapter within the broader collapse of German occupation in eastern Poland in 1944. Chapter 7, Segment 5. Liberation, Silence, and the Immediate Post-Occupation Landscape. When Soviet forces entered the Lublin district in July 1944 and German occupation authority collapsed across eastern Poland, the site of Trawniki passed abruptly from SS control into a new political and military reality, embedding the former camp within a moment of transition defined less by formal ceremony than by sudden absence, because unlike liberation scenes at large concentration camps encountered by Western Allied forces in 1945, Trawniki had already been evacuated and partially abandoned by the time the Red Army advanced into the region, and what remained was not a functioning training hub or labor installation but a compound marked by physical traces, disrupted infrastructure, and the residual silence of a dismantled institution, illustrating how the end of occupation did not always coincide with direct confrontation at each site, and the Soviet authorities who entered the area encountered the remnants of barracks, fencing, and administrative buildings, as well as the landscape that had borne witness to both training operations and the November 1943 mass shootings carried out during Operation Harvest Festival, embedding the camp within the broader narrative of wartime devastation unfolding across eastern Poland, and immediate post-occupation attention in the region was focused on military stabilization, restoration of civil administration, and investigation of crimes committed under German rule, meaning that sites such as Trawniki were documented within a larger framework of examining occupation policy and its consequences, and the physical quiet that followed German withdrawal contrasted sharply with the disciplined activity that had characterized the camp during its operational years, reinforcing the abrupt shift from structured authority to open landscape, and for the surrounding local population, the departure of SS personnel marked a decisive end to the visible presence of occupation power, though the memory of deportations, forced labor, and mass shootings lingered within the community, embedding Trawniki's history within local as well as regional consciousness. And examining this immediate post-occupation phase clarifies that Trawniki's dissolution was not accompanied by grand dismantling ceremonies, but by gradual fading of administrative presence under advancing front lines, illustrating how institutional systems collapse when military and political structures sustaining them are removed, and the railway line that once carried auxiliary guards and prisoner transports now served different logistical functions under new authority, reinforcing the continuity of infrastructure even as regimes changed. And as Chapter 7 concludes, this focus on liberation and silence underscores that the operational life of Trawniki ended quietly in comparison to its peak years. Yet its significance did not vanish with the departure of German forces, because the ground retained the imprint of preparation, exploitation, and mass violence, embedding the former camp within the broader history of occupation, collapse, and remembrance in eastern Poland. Chapter 8, Segment 1. Post-war investigations and the documentation of Trawniki's role. After the collapse of German occupation authority in eastern Poland in 1944 and the end of the war in Europe in May 1945, the former site of Trawniki entered a new phase defined not by training cycles or forced labor but by investigation, documentation, and the gradual construction of historical record, embedding the camp within the broader effort to understand and prosecute crimes committed under the Nazi regime. And although Trawniki did not possess the scale or notoriety of extermination centers such as Treblinka or Sobibór, its function as a training ground for auxiliary guards and as a site of mass shooting during Operation Harvest Festival ensured that it occupied a distinct place within post-war inquiries, reinforcing the importance of examining not only killing centers but also the institutional nodes that supported them. And Soviet investigative bodies initially documented evidence across the Lublin district, recording testimonies from local witnesses and surviving documentation where available, embedding Trawniki within the early efforts to catalog occupation crimes. And in the years that followed, both Polish and international investigations sought to reconstruct the structure of Operation Reinhard, tracing the movement of personnel trained at Trawniki to extermination camps and ghetto liquidation actions, illustrating how the camp's significance lay in its systemic contribution rather than in a single episode alone, and surviving administrative fragments. transport lists, and personnel records provided insight into the organization of the auxiliary units known as the Trawniki men, reinforcing that genocide relied upon documented recruitment and deployment processes embedded within bureaucratic channels, and testimony from survivors of forced labor at Trawniki, as well as from individuals who encountered auxiliary guards elsewhere, contributed to building a layered understanding of the camp's role, embedding personal memory within legal and historical frameworks, and the November 1943 mass shootings carried out during Operation Harvest Festival were also examined as part of broader inquiries into coordinated killings in the Lublin district, reinforcing that Trawniki was one of several interconnected sites where policy decisions translated into direct violence, and the quiet rural setting once again stood in contrast to the gravity of the historical work unfolding in archives and courtrooms as investigators pieced together the administrative pathways linking Trawniki to Globoknik's headquarters and to extermination centers across occupied Poland, illustrating how the camp story could only be fully understood within the network it sustained. And examining this post-war investigative phase clarifies that Trawnike's historical importance lies not merely in its physical footprint but in the documentary trail that connected it to the machinery behind the death camps, embedding it firmly within the broader narrative of the Holocaust's operational architecture. And as Chapter 8 begins, this focus on documentation and inquiry underscores that the dismantling of the camp did not end its relevance, because the search for accountability and historical clarity transformed Trawniki from an active institution into a subject of sustained examination within the post-war reckoning of Nazi crimes. Chapter 8, Segment 2: Trials, Accountability, and the Question of Responsibility. In the years following the war, as evidence from occupied Poland was collected and organized into legal cases, the individuals connected to Trawniki, particularly the auxiliary guards trained there, became part of a complex and prolonged process of judicial examination that unfolded across multiple countries and decades, embedding the legacy of the camp within post-war legal systems that sought to define responsibility for crimes committed during Operation Reinhard. And unlike the highest-ranking SS leaders who were tried at the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, many of the men associated with Trawniki operated at lower hierarchical levels, raising intricate questions about command responsibility, direct participation, and the extent of individual culpability within a structured system of genocide. And early post-war proceedings in Poland and the Soviet Union addressed crimes committed in the Lublin district, including the coordinated mass shootings of November 1943, while later investigations in West Germany examined the role of SS officers and auxiliary personnel connected to extermination camps supplied by Trawniki, illustrating how the camp's influence extended into courtrooms far removed from its rural setting. And in these trials, prosecutors relied on administrative records, transport lists, and witness testimony to reconstruct the chain of command linking Trawnike's training compound to deportations, ghetto liquidations, and extermination sites, embedding the camp within a documented framework of systematic operation rather than isolated acts. And the term Trawniki men entered legal vocabulary to describe the auxiliary guards trained at the camp, reinforcing the recognition that genocide depended not only on central planners but on the organized participation of recruited personnel. And some defendants argued that they acted under coercion or lacked full awareness of extermination policies, prompting courts to examine the structure of authority, the clarity of directives, and the degree of voluntary involvement, illustrating the difficulty of assigning individual responsibility within a hierarchical system designed to diffuse accountability downward. And in certain cases, convictions were secured based on evidence demonstrating active participation in deportations or supervision at extermination camps, while other cases revealed gaps in documentation that complicated prosecution, reinforcing the tension between historical reconstruction and legal standards of proof. And across these proceedings, the name Trawniki appeared repeatedly as a training and assignment point within Operation Reinhard, embedding the camp within the broader judicial reckoning that unfolded in the decades after 1945. And examining these trials clarifies that Trawnike's historical significance lies not only in its operational role but in the enduring effort to confront the mechanisms that sustain genocide, because the courtroom became another arena in which the structure behind the death camps was analyzed, documented, and debated, and the quiet fields of Eastern Poland contrast sharply with the international legal discourse that would later surround the camp's personnel, reinforcing how places of preparation and administration continue to resonate long after physical structures fade. And as Chapter 8 continues, this focus on accountability underscores that the dismantling of Trawniki did not conclude its history, but rather initiated a prolonged process of legal and moral examination aimed at defining responsibility within the machinery of Operation Reinhard. Chapter 8, Segment 3: Survivor Testimony, Historical Research, and the Reconstruction of Memory. Beyond the courtroom and formal legal proceedings, the post-war understanding of Trawniki was shaped profoundly by survivor testimony, archival research, and the gradual work of historians who sought to reconstruct the layered functions of the camp within the broader framework of Operation Reinhard, embedding the site within a narrative built not only from administrative documents but from lived experience and long-term scholarly analysis. And although Trawniki did not leave behind the same volume of preserved physical infrastructure as larger concentration camps, fragments of documentation, combined with recollections from those who endured forced labor there or encountered Trawniki-trained guards elsewhere, formed the foundation for historical reconstruction, illustrating how memory and record intersect in the study of genocide. And survivors who had been imprisoned at Trawniki described the routines of labor, the structure of barracks life, the separation between prisoner areas and guard training grounds, and the atmosphere of uncertainty that defined daily existence, embedding human experience within the structural analysis of administrative systems, while others who survived deportations recounted encounters with auxiliary guards identified as having been trained at Trawniki, reinforcing the connection between preparation and execution across multiple sites. And historians examining Operation Reinhard traced personnel files, deployment lists, and regional directives issued from Lublin to understand how Trawniki functioned as a central training hub, embedding it firmly within the network that linked Belzec, Sobibór, and Treblinka. And the mass shootings carried out during Operation Harvest Festival were documented through both eyewitness accounts and post-war investigative reports, reinforcing that Trawnike's role extended beyond preparation to direct participation in coordinated killing. And over time, scholarly research emphasized the systemic character of the camp, demonstrating that its significance lies not in isolated events but in its structural contribution to sustaining extermination operations. And as archives in Poland, Germany, and elsewhere became more accessible in the later 20th century, researchers were able to piece together a clearer administrative picture of the Auxiliary Guard program, embedding Trawniki within a broader understanding of how the SS addressed manpower shortages through organized recruitment and training. And examining these layers of testimony and scholarship clarifies that the history of Trawniki is neither static nor singular, but the product of ongoing dialogue between documentary evidence and personal memory, reinforcing the idea that historical truth emerges through careful comparison and contextualization rather than immediate revelation. And the rural landscape where the camp once operated stands today as a quiet reminder that even modest sites can carry profound historical weight. Because beneath ordinary fields and modest structures lies a narrative reconstructed through decades of research and remembrance. And as Chapter 8 continues, this focus on testimony and scholarship underscores that Trawnike's legacy persists through the sustained effort to understand how institutional structures, individual actions, and regional policies converged within one training camp that stood behind the death camps of Operation Reinhard. Chapter 8, Segment 4: The Trawniki Men in Global Memory and Late 20th Century Prosecutions. As decades passed after the war, the name Trawniki continued to surface not only in academic research but in renewed legal proceedings and international debates concerning accountability, embedding the former training camp within a long arc of global memory that extended far beyond Eastern Poland. And during the late 20th century, several investigations in the United States, Canada, Germany, and other countries focused on individuals who had immigrated after the war and were later identified as former auxiliary guards trained at Trawniki, reinforcing how the personnel network generated in a small rural compound could carry consequences across continents and generations, and in these cases immigration records, wartime documentation, and archival lists were compared to establish whether individuals had concealed their service as members of SS-supervised auxiliary units, illustrating how bureaucratic traces from the 1940s continued to shape judicial action decades later. And the phrase Trawniki men entered broader public discourse as journalists and historians examined the structure of Operation Reinhard and the role of non-German auxiliaries within extermination camp systems, embedding the camp within narratives of transnational justice and delayed reckoning, and some cases resulted in denaturalization proceedings or deportations based on evidence linking defendants to guard service at camps supplied by Trawniki, reinforcing the principle that participation in genocide, even at lower hierarchical levels, carried enduring legal implications, while other cases highlighted the evidentiary challenges inherent in prosecuting events that had occurred decades earlier, illustrating the tension between historical knowledge and courtroom standards. And these late prosecutions contributed to a wider understanding that genocide was not executed solely by a small circle of high-ranking officials but depended upon structured recruitment and training processes, such as those organized at Trawniki, embedding the camp within global conversations about complicity and responsibility, and scholars analyzing these proceedings emphasized the importance of tracing administrative pathways, demonstrating how personnel files and transport lists reconstructed the movement of auxiliaries from Trawniki to extermination camps, reinforcing the systemic character of Operation Reinhard, and public awareness of these cases also shaped collective memory, as documentaries, books, and educational programs incorporated the story of the Trawniki training camp into broader accounts of the Holocaust, embedding it within narratives that seek to explain how institutional structures enabled mass murder, and the quiet rural fields where the camp once stood stand in contrast to the international scope of its post-war legacy, reminding us that places of preparation can have consequences that echo across decades and borders. And as Chapter 8 continues, this focus on global memory and late prosecutions underscores that Trawniki's significance did not end with its physical dissolution but persists within ongoing efforts to confront, document, and interpret the human networks that sustain the machinery behind the death camps. Chapter 8, Segment 5. Archival Preservation, Historical Interpretation, and the Responsibility of Study. In the decades following the war and the successive waves of trials and investigations that brought renewed attention to the role of the Trawniki training camp, a quieter but equally significant process unfolded within archives, research institutions, and memorial organizations dedicated to preserving documentary evidence and sustaining careful historical interpretation, embedding the former camp within an ongoing intellectual framework that seeks not only to record events but to understand their structural meaning. And because Trawniki functioned primarily as a training and administrative node within Operation Reinhard, rather than as a large extermination complex with extensive surviving infrastructure, much of its history has been reconstructed through fragments of paperwork, personnel lists, testimonies, regional directives, and cross-reference documentation linking it to Belzec, Sobibór, Treblinka, and the Lublin district headquarters of WWII, illustrating how scholarly reconstruction relies on layered comparison rather than singular discovery, and archival institutions in Poland and Germany preserved records relating to auxiliary guard recruitment and deployment, embedding the name Trawniki within catalogs that document the movement of personnel across the occupied territories, while historians pieced together administrative chains that clarified how a relatively small rural compound could exert disproportionate influence within the machinery behind the death camps. And this work of interpretation emphasized the systemic character of genocide, demonstrating that preparation sites, training programs, and bureaucratic coordination were as essential to the functioning of extermination operations as the killing facilities themselves, reinforcing the importance of examining every institutional layer. And academic studies over time have highlighted the complexity of the Auxiliary Guard program, tracing the recruitment of Soviet prisoners of war and other individuals who were processed at Trawniki and later assigned to Reinhard camps, embedding the camp within a broader discussion of coercion, collaboration, hierarchy, and individual agency within structured systems of violence, and the November 1943 mass shootings carried out during Operation Harvest Festival have also been contextualized within district-wide analyses, reinforcing that Trawniki was not an isolated site but part of a coordinated action that reshaped the Lublin region in a matter of days, and as educational curricula increasingly incorporated detailed examination of Operation Reinhard, Trawniki has come to be recognized as a critical element in explaining how the SS addressed manpower shortages and institutionalized training procedures to sustain extermination policy, embedding it within teaching frameworks that emphasize structure over sensationalism. And the responsibility of historical study in this context lies in maintaining clarity, accuracy, and proportionality, avoiding exaggeration while refusing minimization, reinforcing the principle that understanding genocide requires disciplined attention to administrative design and human consequence alike, and the quiet fields of eastern Poland where Trawniki once operated offer little visual indication of the layered history reconstructed through archives and testimony. Yet through sustained research, the camp's role has been integrated into a broader comprehension of how Operation Reinhard functioned as a coordinated system, and as Chapter 8 concludes, this focus on archival preservation and scholarly responsibility underscores that the legacy of Trawniki persists not only in memory and trial records but in the careful, ongoing effort to interpret its place within the machinery of the Holocaust, embedding the site within a continuing commitment to historical accuracy and measured remembrance. Chapter 9, Segment 1. The physical site after the war and the transformation of landscape. In the years following the end of the Second World War, the physical site of Trawniki entered a prolonged period of transformation, embedding the former camp within the evolving social and political landscape of post-war Poland, and unlike larger concentration camps that were immediately preserved in their original form as memorial institutions, Trawniki did not retain the same level of intact infrastructure, meaning that its physical traces were gradually altered by practical reuse, local development, and the passage of time, illustrating how some locations central to the machinery of genocide recede into ordinary surroundings more quickly than others, and in the immediate post-war years parts of the camp area were repurposed for civilian use, with existing buildings adapted to serve administrative or residential functions under new authorities, embedding the site within everyday life even as its past remained embedded in memory, and the barracks, fences, and training grounds that once structured disciplined routine were dismantled, modified, or absorbed into the surrounding settlement, reinforcing the quiet erasure that often accompanies abandoned institutional spaces, and the railway line that had once facilitated the transport of auxiliary guards and prisoner groups continued to operate as part of regional infrastructure, illustrating continuity of geography despite rupture in historical function. And over time vegetation reclaimed portions of the compound, softening the visual boundaries that had once separated prisoner sections from guard quarters, embedding the memory of spatial hierarchy beneath layers of seasonal growth. And for local residents, the presence of the former campsite became part of the community's complex historical inheritance, situated between daily life and collective remembrance, reinforcing how landscapes can hold multiple narratives simultaneously. And examining this transformation clarifies that the disappearance of visible structures does not equate to disappearance of historical significance, because the meaning of Trawniki persists through documentation, testimony, and scholarship even as the physical layout changes. And the quiet fields that once concealed drill formations and forced labor details now reflect agricultural rhythms similar to those that predated the camp's establishment, reinforcing the cyclical character of rural environments in contrast to the abrupt intensity of wartime occupation. And as Chapter 9 begins, this focus on the post-war landscape underscores the contrast between institutional precision and natural reclamation, illustrating how places that once functioned as structured nodes within the machinery behind the death camps gradually blend back into ordinary terrain while retaining profound historical weight beneath the surface. Chapter 9, Segment 2. Local memory, community awareness, and the quiet presence of history. In the decades after the war, as the physical structures of the former Trawniki camp gradually blended into the surrounding settlement and countryside, the memory of what had taken place there persisted in more subtle and complex forms, embedding the site within layers of local awareness that did not always manifest through formal memorialization but nonetheless shaped collective understanding of place. And in communities across eastern Poland, former campsites often existed in a quiet tension between everyday routine and historical gravity, reinforcing how landscapes can carry narratives that are not immediately visible yet remain deeply embedded in communal consciousness. And at Trawniki, residents who had lived through the occupation or whose families had witnessed deportations, forced labor details, and the November 1943 mass shootings carried fragments of memory that were transmitted informally across generations, illustrating how oral history functions alongside archival documentation in preserving the contours of the past. And for many years under the post-war political climate in Poland, public discussion of certain aspects of wartime experience was shaped by broader narratives of occupation and resistance, embedding the story of Trawniki within a national framework that emphasized suffering under Nazi rule while sometimes leaving the specific mechanics of auxiliary training and Operation Reinhard less visible in public discourse. And yet the awareness that the rural fields had once contained a camp connected to the machinery behind the death camps did not vanish, reinforcing that historical knowledge often persists beneath official narratives. And over time, local initiatives, educational programs, and collaboration with historians contributed to a clearer articulation of Trawnike's role, embedding the site within a broader European effort to confront and document the complexity of Holocaust history. And this gradual articulation underscores the interplay between proximity and perspective, because those living near former campsites experience history not as distant abstraction but as part of their physical environment, reinforcing the responsibility to balance remembrance with daily continuity. And examining the role of local memory clarifies that Trawnike's significance extends beyond its administrative and operational function, because the human dimension of place includes the ongoing negotiation between past and present within community life and the railway line, agricultural fields, and modest buildings that now define the area coexist with knowledge of what occurred there, illustrating how historical sites do not always remain frozen as monuments but instead integrate into living landscapes. And as Chapter 9 continues, this focus on community awareness emphasizes that remembrance can take many forms, from formal markers to quiet acknowledgement, embedding Trawniki within a layered memory culture that reflects both the passage of time and the enduring weight of its history. Chapter 9, Segment 3, Memorialization, Historical Markers, and the Ethics of Commemoration. As historical research clarified the role of Trawniki within Operation Reinhard and the broader machinery behind the death camps, questions of memorialization gradually emerged, embedding the former camp within the ethical landscape of how societies choose to remember sites of preparation, exploitation, and mass killing. And unlike larger extermination centers that became internationally recognized memorial institutions, Trawnike's identity as a training camp and labor site meant that its commemorative trajectory developed more slowly and often in dialogue with regional initiatives rather than global attention, reinforcing how recognition can vary according to the perceived scale and function of a site. And over time, markers and plaques were established to acknowledge the victims of Operation Harvest Festival and the Jewish prisoners who had been confined there, embedding the physical landscape with interpretive signals that connect present-day visitors to historical context. And these markers serve not only as memorials but as educational prompts, reinforcing the principle that commemoration is inseparable from understanding, and the ethics of commemorating Trawniki involve balancing acknowledgement of its dual function, training auxiliary guards and confining forced laborers, while ensuring that remembrance remains grounded in documented history rather than symbolic abstraction, illustrating the responsibility inherent in shaping public memory. And historians and educators have emphasized that Trawnike's role as a personnel hub underscores how genocide depended upon structured preparation and recruitment, reinforcing the need to commemorate not only the sites of killing but also the systems that enabled them. and the rural environment in which the camp once operated presents unique challenges for memorialization, because the absence of extensive preserved structures requires interpretive work to convey the layered history embedded within ordinary terrain, illustrating how memory can be spatially subtle yet historically profound, and community involvement in maintaining memorial spaces reinforces the connection between local awareness and broader historical responsibility, embedding Trawniki within a living framework of remembrance rather than isolating it as a static monument. And examining the development of historical markers at the site clarifies that commemoration is not merely about preserving ruins but about articulating context, ensuring that the story of auxiliary training, forced labor, and the November 1943 mass shootings remains accessible to future generations, and the quiet fields surrounding Trawniki today serve as both backdrop and reminder, illustrating how places that appear unremarkable can carry immense historical weight when interpreted with care and precision. And as Chapter 9 continues, this focus on memorialization underscores that the responsibility of remembrance extends beyond documentation, requiring deliberate engagement with landscape, narrative, and ethical clarity to ensure that the history of Trawniki remains integrated within the broader understanding of the Holocaust and Operation Reinhard. Chapter 9, Segment 4. Educational integration, public history, and the interpretation of structure. As the decades progressed and scholarship on Operation Reinhard expanded, the former site of Trawniki increasingly entered educational frameworks designed to explain not only the visible extermination centers but also the structural systems that sustained them, embedding the camp within a broader public history effort that seeks to illuminate how genocide was organized, administered, and implemented through layered institutions, and this integration into educational discourse reflects a growing recognition that understanding the Holocaust requires attention to preparation sites, recruitment programs, and bureaucratic coordination as much as to the places where killing occurred directly, reinforcing the importance of examining Trawniki as a central training node rather than a peripheral detail. And museums, academic publications, and documentary projects have incorporated the story of the auxiliary guards trained at Trawniki to demonstrate how limited German SS manpower was, supplemented through structured recruitment and instruction, embedding the camp within explanations of how Operation Reinhard achieved operational scale. And in classroom settings, the discussion of Trawniki often accompanies analysis of deportation logistics, ghetto liquidation procedures, and the interconnection between administrative offices in Lublin and extermination centers in eastern Poland, illustrating how institutional networks functioned as integrated systems rather than isolated sites. And public historians emphasize that focusing on structure does not diminish the human dimension but clarifies the mechanisms that made mass murder possible, reinforcing the ethical responsibility to present complexity without sensationalism. And field visits, where possible, provide opportunities to engage directly with the landscape, embedding learning within physical space even when original camp structures no longer stand prominently, and interpretive materials developed for students and visitors aim to balance factual precision with measured tone, aligning with the broader commitment to sober remembrance that characterizes responsible Holocaust education. And examining the role of Trawniki in public history clarifies that its significance lies not only in its own events, but in the insight it offers into the administrative scaffolding of genocide, reinforcing the principle that preparation, recruitment, documentation, and deployment were integral components of the machinery behind the death camps. And the quiet rural setting, when approached through informed interpretation, becomes a powerful teaching environment, illustrating how ordinary geography can host extraordinary historical lessons when context is carefully articulated. And as Chapter 9 continues, this focus on educational integration underscores that remembrance is sustained not solely through monuments but through ongoing instruction, dialogue, and research that embeds sites like Trawniki within a comprehensive understanding of how Operation Reinhard functioned at every institutional level. Chapter 9, Segment 5. The site in contemporary perspective and the continuity of historical responsibility. In the present day, the former site of Trawniki exists within a landscape that appears calm and unremarkable at first glance, a rural environment shaped by seasonal agriculture, modest residential structures, and the steady passage of ordinary time. Yet beneath this quiet surface lies a layered historical narrative that continues to demand careful attention, embedding the location within the enduring responsibility of remembrance and study. And unlike larger memorial complexes that draw international visitors in significant numbers, Trawniki's contemporary presence is often encountered through research, educational materials, and deliberate inquiry rather than through spontaneous tourism, reinforcing how some critical sites of Holocaust history require active engagement to uncover their significance. And this subtlety underscores the broader ethical question of how societies remember preparation sites, where administrative coordination and personnel training sustained the machinery behind the death camps, even if the visible architecture of extermination is no longer present, and historians emphasize that the importance of Trawniki lies in its structural role, demonstrating how genocide depended upon organized recruitment, documentation, and deployment processes that unfolded far from the gas chambers yet were inseparable from them, embedding the camp within a comprehensive understanding of Operation Reinhard, and contemporary scholarship continues to revisit archival materials, refine interpretations, and integrate new comparative studies that situate Trawniki within the wider network of occupation policy, reinforcing the dynamic character of historical research and educational initiatives ensure that the name Trawniki remains connected to discussions of auxiliary participation, labor exploitation, and the November 1943 mass shootings carried out during Operation Harvest Festival, embedding the site within narratives that emphasize both systemic design and human consequence, and the surrounding community, now part of modern Poland's civic and cultural landscape, lives alongside this layered history, illustrating how places of past violence can coexist with present normalcy while still carrying ethical weight. And the railway line that once connected the camp to Lublin and extermination centers continues its practical function, symbolizing the continuity of infrastructure even as regimes and purposes change, reinforcing the contrast between physical endurance and institutional collapse, and reflecting on Trawniki in contemporary perspective clarifies that remembrance is not solely about preserving structures but about sustaining awareness of how administrative systems, hierarchical authority, and disciplined routine converged in one rural compound to support genocide across a region, embedding the quiet fields within a global narrative of responsibility and understanding. And as Chapter 9 concludes, this focus on present-day reflection underscores that Trawniki's history remains relevant not because of visible ruins alone, but because it offers enduring insight into how structured preparation underpinned the death camps, reminding us that vigilance in study and memory is essential to honoring the past with accuracy, restraint, and depth. Chapter 10, Segment 1. Structural Lessons and the Anatomy of Organized Preparation. In drawing toward the final chapter of this documentary, it becomes necessary to step back from the chronology of events and consider what the history of Trawniki reveals about the structural anatomy of organized genocide. Because the camp's significance lies not only in its specific actions but in the institutional logic it represents, embedding within one rural compound the principles of recruitment, training, documentation, deployment, and coordinated authority that sustained Operation Reinhard at its height. And by examining Trawniki, we see clearly that the machinery behind the death camps did not function through isolated brutality, but through disciplined preparation carried out in stages, reinforcing the idea that genocide unfolded as a process embedded within administrative systems rather than as a spontaneous eruption of violence, and the transformation of Soviet prisoners of war and other recruits into auxiliary guards demonstrates how personnel pipelines were constructed deliberately to compensate for limited German SS manpower, illustrating how bureaucratic planning addressed logistical challenges in ways that integrated human resources into a lethal network, and the coexistence of forced labor within the same compound underscores the layered structure of exploitation and preparation operating simultaneously, reinforcing that economic utilization and extermination policy were interwoven rather than separate tracks. and the November 1943 mass shootings during Operation Harvest Festival mark a stark culmination of the structural continuum, illustrating how labor retention could be reversed abruptly under changing directives. Embedding within the camp's history the fluid boundary between temporary exploitation and immediate annihilation, and the administrative chain linking Trawniki to Odilo Globoknik's headquarters in Lublin demonstrates how regional command coordinated multiple sites through documentation and reporting, reinforcing that the scale of Operation Reinhard depended upon synchronized communication as much as physical infrastructure. And by analyzing Trawniki as a training and administrative hub, we gain insight into the broader pattern of how complex systems of oppression are assembled, maintained, and adapted over time, illustrating that preparation spaces can carry as much historical weight as execution sites because they sustain the human and logistical foundation of policy implementation, and the rural quiet of Eastern Poland once again contrasts with the disciplined routines that once unfolded inside the camp's perimeter, reinforcing the theme that ordinary landscapes can host extraordinary institutional activity when shaped by centralized authority, and understanding the structural dimension encourages a measured perspective that emphasizes process, hierarchy, and coordination rather than isolated episodes, embedding Trawniki within a comprehensive understanding of how the Holocaust functioned at multiple levels simultaneously. And as Chapter 10 begins, this focus on institutional anatomy underscores that the history of Trawniki offers not only a record of events but a framework for examining how organized preparation underpinned the death camps, reminding us that the study of genocide requires attention to the mechanisms that made it operational as well as to the tragedies it produced. Chapter 10, Segment 2. Human Agency Within Structured Systems. As we continue this final chapter, it becomes essential to reflect not only on institutional design but on the human dimension that operated within it, because while Trawniki functioned as a structured administrative node within Operation Reinhard, the system it sustained was ultimately enacted by individuals whose actions unfolded inside clearly defined hierarchies, embedding questions of agency, obedience, and responsibility within the broader framework of organized preparation and examining. The camp through this lens does not shift focus away from structure but rather clarifies how structured authority shapes individual decision-making, illustrating how policies devised at regional headquarters translated into daily routines carried out by instructors, clerks, guards, and labor supervisors, and the auxiliary recruits processed through Trawniki were inserted into a pre-existing chain of command that defined expectations, discipline, and consequences, reinforcing that institutional environments create contexts in which certain behaviors are normalized and reinforced, yet the presence of hierarchy does not eliminate individual participation, because within the disciplined routines of training, deployment, and enforcement, personal choices intersected with administrative directives, embedding moral complexity within bureaucratic order, and the Jewish prisoners confined at Trawniki likewise navigated structured conditions shaped by authority, rationing, and labor demands, illustrating how agency under coercion operates within constrained environments that allow limited autonomy while imposing overarching control, and reflecting on this interplay between system and individual highlights the importance of examining both levels simultaneously, reinforcing that genocide is sustained through the alignment of institutional design with human compliance, and post-war trials and historical research have grappled with this duality, attempting to determine where structural coercion ends and voluntary participation begins, embedding Trawniki within broader debates about responsibility in organized systems of violence, and the concept of the Trawniki men underscores how recruitment and training transformed individuals into functional components of a larger mechanism, illustrating how preparation sites serve as thresholds where identity and role are reshaped within hierarchical frameworks, and yet even within such frameworks, variation in conduct and response can occur, reinforcing that structure influences but does not fully predetermine human behavior, and the quiet rural landscape that once surrounded the camp reminds us that the individuals who entered its gates came from diverse backgrounds and later dispersed into varied post-war trajectories, embedding the history of Trawniki within a continuum of personal narratives that intersect with institutional history. And as this segment concludes, the focus on human agency within structured systems. Underscores that understanding Trawniki requires attention both to the administrative logic that organized genocide and to the individuals who carried out or endured its routines, reminding us that the study of such sites demands careful balance between structural analysis and recognition of human consequence within the machinery behind the death camps. Chapter 10, Segment 3. The broader significance of preparation sites in Holocaust history. As this documentary approaches its final reflections, it is important to widen the lens once more and situate Trawniki within the broader landscape of Holocaust history, because its significance lies not solely in its specific chronology, but in what it reveals about preparation sites as essential components of genocidal systems, embedding the camp within a larger pattern that demonstrates how organized violence depends upon networks of recruitment, instruction, and logistical coordination. Operating beyond the immediate scenes of killing, and when public memory focuses primarily on extermination centers, there is a risk of overlooking the institutional groundwork that enabled those centers to function, reinforcing the necessity of examining places like Trawniki where personnel were organized and integrated into structured hierarchies, and by tracing the administrative connections between the training compound in eastern Poland and extermination sites across the Lublin district. Historians illuminate how genocide was implemented through layered systems rather than isolated facilities, illustrating that preparation, documentation, transportation, and enforcement formed interlocking elements within a coordinated design. And the auxiliary guards trained at Trawniki demonstrate how recruitment strategies expanded operational capacity, embedding additional manpower into camps that would otherwise have faced logistical constraints. And this expansion underscores the adaptive character of the SS apparatus, which responded to practical challenges with organized institutional solutions, reinforcing that genocide evolved through calculated planning rather than spontaneous eruption, and the coexistence of forced labor within the same compound further illustrates how economic exploitation and extermination policy were interwoven strands of a single system, embedding multiple objectives within shared infrastructure. And examining Trawniki as a preparation site encourages a more comprehensive understanding of Operation Reinhard, highlighting that the machinery behind the death camps included not only gas chambers and deportation trains but also training grounds, barracks, rosters, and regional command offices that synchronized human and material resources. And this structural perspective aligns with contemporary scholarship emphasizing that genocide must be studied through its administrative architecture as well as through its immediate human toll, reinforcing the responsibility to analyze complexity without diminishing suffering. And the quiet rural fields where Trawniki once stood offer a visual reminder that preparation sites may appear unremarkable in scale yet carry immense historical weight when examined within their networked context, illustrating how modest compounds can serve as pivotal nodes in systems of destruction. And as this segment closes, the focus on broader significance underscores that Trawniki stands as an example of how organized preparation underpinned the Holocaust, reminding us that understanding genocide requires sustained attention to the processes that made it operational, disciplined, and coordinated across regions and institutions. Chapter 10, Segment 4. Memory, Responsibility, and the Continuity of Historical Understanding. As we move deeper into this final chapter, reflection turns not only to structure and significance but to the enduring responsibility carried by memory itself, because the history of Trawniki exists today within a continuum of documentation, scholarship, education, and moral consideration that extends far beyond the lifespan of the camp, embedding the former training ground within a larger framework of how societies confront the organized systems that enable genocide and remembrance. In this context does not rely solely on preserved architecture or visible ruins, but on sustained engagement with archival records, survivor testimony, and analytical interpretation, reinforcing that historical understanding must remain active rather than passive. And Trawnike's role as a preparation site underscores a crucial lesson, that the machinery behind the death camps was built through incremental steps of recruitment, instruction, paperwork, and coordination, illustrating how administrative precision can coexist with catastrophic human consequence, and this realization carries implications for how we study and teach the Holocaust, emphasizing the necessity of examining institutional design alongside personal narrative, embedding memory within structural clarity rather than emotional simplification, and the post-war trials, scholarly research, and memorial efforts discussed in earlier chapters collectively demonstrate that confronting the legacy of Trawniki involves more than recounting events. It requires ongoing commitment to contextual accuracy and ethical restraint, reinforcing that remembrance must balance solemn acknowledgement with disciplined analysis. And as generations pass and direct witnesses become fewer, the responsibility to preserve and interpret the history of sites like Trawniki grows increasingly reliant on educators, archivists, and researchers who maintain continuity of knowledge, embedding the camp within the broader project of safeguarding historical truth. And the quiet landscape that once contained barracks and drill grounds now stands as a subtle reminder that places of preparation can fade physically while remaining powerful symbolically, illustrating how the absence of visible structures does not erase historical presence, and reflecting on memory in this way encourages a form of remembrance that is neither theatrical nor abstract but grounded in documented fact and careful explanation, reinforcing the values of accuracy and respect that guide responsible historical inquiry. And as this segment concludes, the focus on memory and responsibility underscores that Trawnike's history continues to matter not only because of what occurred there but because it teaches how organized systems can mobilize ordinary spaces and individuals into extraordinary harm, reminding us that vigilance in study, documentation, and ethical reflection remains essential in preserving understanding of the machinery behind the death camps. Chapter 10, Segment 5. Returning to the landscape and the quiet weight of history. We end where we began, with the landscape itself. The flat ground of eastern Poland. The railway line cutting quietly through open space. The fields that shift color with the seasons. The wind that moves without memory, yet across soil that holds it. Trawniki today does not present towering ruins or monumental gates. It does not announce itself with the scale of larger concentration camps. And yet, its historical weight is carried not in visible enormity but in structural significance. Here, within what appears to be ordinary rural terrain, a training system was organized. Here, personnel were recruited, processed, instructed, documented, and deployed. Here, the machinery behind the death camps was reinforced through disciplined preparation. And here, in November 1943, the remaining Jewish prisoners were murdered during Operation Harvest Festival, binding the site directly to the final phase of coordinated killing in the Lublin district. The story of Trawniki teaches that genocide does not rely solely on the places where victims arrive at the end of deportation trains. It relies on planning offices, on rosters,
On drill formation.
on reporting chains, on routine. It relies on structure. The auxiliary guards trained here became part of extermination centers such as Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. The administrators here reported to regional leadership in Lublin. The railway here connected outward to the wider geography of Operation Reinhard. And the laborers confined here sustained the compound that trained those guards. Preparation and exploitation coexisted. Coordination and violence were interwoven. Yet the fields remained quiet. That quiet remains today. There is no sound now of roll calls. No shouted commands across drill grounds.
No transan loading recruits.
No workshops operating under guard supervision. What remains is space and history. The transformation from active institution to silent landscape reminds us that organized systems can disappear physically while leaving lasting institutional lessons behind. Trawniki stands as evidence that the Holocaust was sustained by networks, not by isolated brutality. It was implemented through documented authority, layered hierarchy, and structured manpower solutions. It depended on training grounds as much as extermination camps. And because of that, places like this matter deeply in understanding how the machinery of genocide functioned. Today, remembering Trawniki requires calm attention. It requires clarity without exaggeration. It requires acknowledgement without spectacle. The ground is quiet, but the history remains. And understanding that history is part of preserving its meaning. Today, the fields of Trawniki are quiet. The barracks are gone. The drill formations have faded. The trains no longer arrive with orders or assignments. But the history remains. Trawniki reminds us that the machinery behind the death camps was built not only in places of extermination, but in places of preparation, in training grounds, in offices, in structured routines carried out far from public view. Understanding these structures is part of honoring the victims and preserving historical clarity. If you value complete, long-form Holocaust history told calmly and respectfully, consider subscribing to In and Out Nazi Germany. Thank you for listening.